Caleb Whitmore fell to his knees in front of a locked gate at midnight, pounding both fists against the wood until his knuckles split open, and screamed into the darkness that he would die right there on that porch before he carried his dying daughter one more mile. Rain hammered his back. Emma's small body had gone still in his arms, her breathing shallow, her lips cracked from 3 days without proper water. Caleb had nothing left. No coin, no kin, no mercy left to beg for. And still he pounded on that gate like a man pounding on the gates of heaven itself, because heaven was the only place left that hadn't yet turned him away. If this story pulls at your heart, the way it's pulling at mine right now, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels before it's through. Now let's go back to where it all began. Kansas had been good to Caleb Whitmore once. He'd had 200 acres of wheat, a wife named Mary, who sang while she kneaded bread, and a daughter who used to run through the fields chasing grasshoppers, with her skirt hiked up past her knees, laughing loud enough to wake the whole county. That had been the life he was owed, he'd believed. A man worked hard, he prayed hard, and the Lord rewarded him for it. Then the drought came. It didn't come all at once. It crept in slow, the way sickness does, until one summer there wasn't a green stalk left standing in 3 counties. Caleb borrowed against the land to buy seed the following spring. The seed failed too. He borrowed again, and again. By the time Mary took ill with the winter fever, the bank already owned more of that farm than he did. She died in February, in a bed too cold to keep her warm, with Caleb holding her hand and promising her something he had no earthly way of keeping. "I'll take care of our girl," he'd whispered. "I swear it on my life, Mary. She'll never go without." Mary had looked up at him with eyes already half gone to the next world, and said the only thing she had strength left to say. "Don't let her forget how to laugh, Caleb. Whatever else happens to you, don't let that go." He buried her on a Tuesday. By that Friday, the bank sent a man in a clean black coat to nail a notice to his front door. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of walking. 6 months of odd jobs that paid in bread instead of coin, of sleeping in barns that weren't his, of watching his daughter grow thinner while he told her again and again that they'd find a good place soon, a place with a warm bed and food on the table, a place where nobody would ever make them leave. He hadn't believed his own words in a long time, but Emma still did. That was the terrible thing about a 5-year-old's faith. It didn't care whether the man wearing it out had run dry. By the time they crossed into Montana territory, Emma had stopped asking where they were headed. She'd stopped asking for anything at all, which frightened Caleb far worse than her crying ever had. A child who quit asking for things wasn't a patient child. She was a child who'd learned that asking didn't change anything. "Papa," she said one evening, her voice thin as paper. "My head feels like there's a fire in it." Caleb pressed his palm to her forehead and felt heat rolling off her skin, like a stove left burning too long. He had no medicine, no doctor, no money for either. "You're gonna be just fine, sweetheart," he told her, and hated himself for the lie even as it left his mouth. He'd heard talk in the last town from a toothless old drover leaning against a feed store about a big cattle operation out past the ridge. The Blackwood Ranch, the man called it, run by some widow who'd somehow held onto the place after her husband died, when half the county figured she'd be sold out inside a year. "Strange woman," the drover had said, spitting tobacco into the dust. "Big as a barn door and twice as stubborn. Nobody thought she'd last. She's lasted 5 years now. Runs more cattle than half the outfits twice her size." Caleb hadn't cared what she looked like or how she talked. He'd cared about one thing only, a rumor that she paid fair wages and didn't ask too many questions about a man's past. That was enough. That had to be enough. So he'd walked. He'd walked with Emma's weight growing heavier in his arms every hour, her fever climbing with the sun until the sun went down, and he was still walking. And the road turned into a rutted trail, and the trail led him at last to a wooden gate with a hand-painted sign reading Blackwood Ranch, nailed crooked to one post. That was when the rain started. That was when Emma stopped answering him when he said her name. That was when Caleb Whitmore, a man who had once owned 200 acres, and never begged another soul for anything in his life, fell to his knees in the mud, and started pounding on a stranger's gate, like the devil himself was chasing him. "Please." His voice cracked apart on the word. "Somebody, please, my daughter's dying. I got nowhere else. Please God, somebody open this gate." He opened this. A dog started barking somewhere past the darkness. Then a lantern bobbed into view, swinging in a wide arc as somebody came running. "Who's out there?" A woman's voice called sharp and unafraid. "State your business or get off my land." "My little girl," Caleb managed. "She's burning up. I ain't got nowhere else to take her. Please, ma'am, I'm begging you." The lantern light swung closer, and Caleb saw her clear for the first time, a tall woman broad through the shoulders, her hair pulled back in a braid that had come half undone. A shotgun cradled in the crook of her arm like she'd carried it 1,000 times before, and knew exactly how to use it if she had to. She wasn't young. She wasn't delicate. She looked, Caleb thought, in the one clear corner of his exhausted mind like a woman the wind had tried to knock down more than once, and never once managed it. She held the lantern up and looked at him. Then she looked at the child in his arms, and something in her face changed so fast it was like watching a storm break. "Lord above," she breathed. She was already unbarring the gate before she finished the sentence. "Get her inside, now. Don't stand there, move." Caleb didn't need telling twice. He staggered through the gate on legs that had carried him 15 miles that day alone, and the woman was already turning, already shouting toward the house behind her. "Sarah, Sarah, get the kettle going and clear the kitchen table. We've got a sick child coming in." A younger woman appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, eyes going wide at the sight of Caleb half collapsing up the path with a limp child in his arms. "Clara, who?" Questions later, the woman named Clara said, "Move, girl." Inside, the warmth of the house hit Caleb like a wall, and it nearly dropped him where he stood. He hadn't felt a fire's heat in days that wasn't stolen from someone else's barn. Clara cleared a space at the long kitchen table with one sweep of her arm, sending a basket of mending to the floor without a second glance, and Caleb laid Emma down as gently as his shaking arms would allow. "She's been sick 3 days, he said, the words tumbling out now that he didn't have to save his strength for walking. "Fever. Won't hardly eat. I couldn't get her to a doctor. I didn't have the money. I tried everything. Stop." Clara's voice wasn't unkind, but it cut through his rambling like a blade through rope. She was already at Emma's side, pressing the back of her hand to the child's forehead, then her wrist counting something under her breath. "How old is she?" "5. "Has she been coughing?" "Anything come up when she eats?" "No coughing. She can't hold food down some days. Other days, she won't eat at all." Clara's jaw tightened. "Sarah, I need the willow bark tea started, and bring down the chest from my room, the one with the red cloth on it, and a basin of cool water, not cold, cool." She looked up at Caleb, and for the first time something almost gentle passed over her face. "You did right bringing her here. You hear me? You did right." Caleb's knees buckled. He hadn't meant them to. He hadn't cried in 6 months. Not when the bank took the farm. Not when he buried his wife. Not when he'd gone 2 days without food, so Emma could eat what little there was. But something about a stranger telling him he'd done right broke something loose in his chest that he'd been holding shut by sheer will alone, and he sat down hard on the kitchen floor and put his face in his hands and wept. Clara didn't say anything for a moment. She let him have it. Let him have the 2 or 3 minutes it took a man to fall apart after months of refusing to. Then she crouched down in front of him, her knees popping with the effort, and put one broad, work-roughened hand on his shoulder. "Look at me," she said. He looked up. Her eyes were pale gray, steady, unflinching, the kind of eyes that had looked at hard things before and hadn't looked away. "Your girl is going to be all right," Clara said. "I've nursed fever before. Worse than this. You hear me? She's going to be all right, and so are you, but I need you to hold yourself together another hour while we get her settled. Can you do that?" Caleb wiped his face with the back of a filthy sleeve and nodded. "Good." Clara stood offering him a hand up that he was too proud to take and too weak to refuse, so he ended up gripping it anyway. "Now, who are you, And how'd two lost souls end up pounding on my gate at midnight in a rainstorm? Caleb Whitmore. He swallowed. That's Emma, my daughter. I heard tell in the last town that you run a ranch out this way that you might be hiring. Something flickered across Clara's face, surprise maybe, or wariness. You walked here on the strength of a rumor. I walked here because I didn't have another choice, Caleb said. I had a farm in Kansas, lost it to drought and debt, lost my wife the same winter, been on the road with Emma near 6 months now, taking whatever work I could find. I ain't asking for charity, ma'am. I'm asking for work. Any work you've got. I'll muck stalls, mend fences, break horses, whatever needs doing. I'll do it, His voice cracked again. I just need somewhere for my girl to be safe. Clara studied him a long moment, the lantern light throwing shadows across her broad, weathered face. Caleb had the strange sensation of being weighed on some scale he couldn't see, and found he didn't much mind it. A woman who'd open her gate to a stranger screaming in the rain had earned the right to look a man over before she decided what to do with him. You haven't eaten, she said finally. It wasn't a question. Ma'am, I said you haven't eaten. Not today, and not much of anything the day before either, unless I miss my guess. Her eyes flicked over him, his sunken cheeks the way his hands trembled even now that he'd stopped exerting himself. The belt cinched 2 extra notches past where it belonged. You gave whatever food you had to her. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. Something shifted in Clara's expression, then something that looked almost like recognition, like she was seeing a piece of her own reflection in a stranger's exhausted face. Sit down at that table, she said. Sarah's going to bring you something hot, and you're going to eat every bite of it. And then we're going to talk about what happens next. Don't argue with me. I run this ranch and I don't much care for arguing. Caleb sat. The next hour passed in a blur of motion. He only half-registered Sarah moving between the stove and the table. A mug of tea pressed into his hands that he drank without tasting. Clara working over Emma, with a competence that told him this wasn't the first sick child she'd nursed through a bad night. She sponged Emma's forehead with cool water, coaxed a few spoonfuls of broth past her cracked lips, wrapped her in blankets warmed by the fire. She's dehydrated bad, Clara said at one point mostly to herself. That's most of this fever right there. Not enough water in her these past few days. We get fluid into her steady. Keep her cool. She'll break this fever by morning most likely. Most likely, Caleb repeated, and heard the fear still shaking in his own voice. Clara looked up at him. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you I know for certain, Mr. Whitmore. I'm no doctor, but I've seen 100 fevers in my time on this ranch and off it, and this one doesn't have the look of the ones that take a child. She's sick, and she's weak, but she's fighting. You can see it in how she's gripping that blanket, even half out of her senses. That's a girl who wants to live. Caleb looked at his daughter's small fist curled tight around the edge of the quilt, and something in his chest that had been clenched for 6 months eased just slightly for the first time. Thank you, he said. I don't have the words for what I owe you tonight. You don't owe me anything yet, Clara said. Owing comes later if it comes at all. Right now you're going to finish that stew, and then you're going to sleep, because a man who hasn't slept proper in days is no use to anybody, least of all his daughter. It was well past 2 in the morning by the time Clara finally sat down across from him at her own table, a mug of black coffee cradled in both hands, and looked at him with the frank, unhurried gaze of a woman who had decided something and wasn't going to waste time getting to it. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Whitmore, she said. The truth. I've had liars sit at this table before, and I've learned to smell one coming. So Caleb told her. He told her about the farm, about Mary, about the notice nailed to his door, and the 6 months of walking that followed. He told her things he hadn't said out loud to another living soul, how he'd gone hungry so Emma could eat, how he'd slept sitting up in barn doorways so he'd hear anyone coming before they got close to his daughter, how he'd started to wonder somewhere around month 4 whether he'd made a mistake keeping her instead of leaving her with kin back east, who might have fed her better than he ever could. I never had kin worth leaving her with, he admitted. That's the truth of it. It was just me and her. Always been just me and her since Mary passed. And there were nights I laid awake wondering if that was fair to ask of a 5-year-old girl to depend on a man who couldn't even keep a roof over her head. Clara was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee mug slowly on the table. "You know what I think, Mr. Whitmore," she said finally. "What's that, ma'am?" "I think a man who'd rather go hungry than let his daughter go without is exactly the kind of man worth having on my land." She set the mug down. "I've got 200 head of cattle and not near enough hands to manage them proper. My last foreman quit on me 3 weeks back. Didn't like taking orders from a woman if you want the truth of it, and good riddance to him. I need someone who can mend fencework stock and isn't too proud to take direction from someone who's been running this operation longer than he's had that beard on his face." Caleb sat up straighter. "Ma'am, I can do all that. I ran my own spread for near 10 years before—" "I know you can," Clara said. "I could tell that the moment you walked through my gate carrying a 15-mile weight in your arms without once setting her down to rest your own back. A man doesn't build strength like that sitting idle." She leaned forward. "The job's yours if you want it. Fair wages paid regular, and a roof that won't have a bank notice nailed to it. There's a bunkhouse out past the barn, but it's rough quarters for a child, especially one just coming off a fever. I've got a spare room in the main house that'll suit her a sight better at least till she's back on her feet proper." Caleb's throat tightened. "Ma'am, I can't ask you to take us into your own home. You don't know us. You don't know anything about—" "I know enough," Clara said, and something in her voice had gone quiet and strange, like she was walking up on the edge of something she didn't often speak of. "I had a daughter once." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Caleb went very still. "Ma'am, her name was Rose." Clara's eyes had gone somewhere far away, somewhere Caleb couldn't follow. "She'd be 9 years old this spring if the fever hadn't taken her 3 winters back. Same kind of fever your Emma's fighting tonight as it happens. Only I didn't have anybody to run to. My husband had passed the year before, and I sat up with her 3 nights straight doing everything I knew how to do, and it wasn't enough." She looked up and her eyes were dry, but there was a weight behind them that told Caleb the dryness had cost her something to hold on to. "I've had 3 years to think on what I might have done different. 3 years of an empty house with too many rooms and not enough voices in it. And tonight, a stranger comes pounding on my gate with a sick child in his arms, and you want to know something. Mr. Whitmore, what's that?" For a moment before I even saw her face clear, I thought the Lord was giving me a second chance I didn't deserve and hadn't asked for. Clara shook her head, almost laughing at herself, though there was no real humor in it. "That's foolish talk, I know. She's your daughter, not mine, and I've no right to go feeling anything about her at all beyond common Christian charity. But I mean to help that child get well if it's within my power, and I mean to give you honest work and a fair chance. And what you make of either one is your business, not mine." Caleb sat with that for a long moment, the fire popping in the hearth. Emma's breathing steady and soft from the corner where Sarah had made up a pallet near the warmth. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for your loss. That's a wound no parent should have to carry." "No," Clara agreed. "They shouldn't. But most of us carry something one way or another. Yours is a farm you lost and a wife in the ground. Mine's a little girl who should be running through my kitchen right now instead of resting under a headstone out past the north pasture." She stood gathering the coffee mugs. "We'll speak more of it in the morning once you've slept and your girl's fever has had a chance to break. For tonight there's a bed made up for you in the room off the kitchen, and Emma can stay right there by the fire where Sarah and I can watch her through the night." "Ma'am, I couldn't ask you to sit up." "You didn't ask," Clara said, a hint of iron creeping back into her voice. The same iron Caleb suspected had kept this ranch standing through 5 hard years when everyone expected it to fall. "I'm offering. There's a considerable difference between the two, Mr. Whitmore, and you'd do well to learn it if you mean to stay under my roof. Now go on and sleep. Morning comes early on a working ranch, and I intend to see just how much truth there was in that talk about you knowing your way around cattle." Caleb went to the small room off the kitchen as told, but sleep didn't come easy, even exhausted as he was. He lay on a bed softer than any he'd known in 6 months, and listened to the quiet sounds of the house settling around him. Clara's footsteps, soft and careful, checking on Emma through the night. The low murmur of her voice when the girl stirred and cried out once for her mother. The particular hush of a house where somebody was keeping watch. He thought about Mary, about the promise he'd made her in that cold February bedroom. He'll never go without, he'd sworn. He'd broken that promise 100 times over these past 6 months, in 100 small and terrible ways, and he'd carried the shame of it like a stone in his chest every single day since. But tonight, for the first time, that stone had shifted just slightly. Not gone. He didn't think shame like that ever fully left a man, but shifted enough that he could breathe around it, could believe for the length of one warm night under a stranger's roof that tomorrow might not be another day of walking toward nothing. He woke before dawn to the sound of Clara's voice in the kitchen, low and urgent. "Her fever's breaking," she was saying, and Caleb was on his feet and through the door before he'd fully understood he was moving. Emma lay on the pallet by the fire, her small face damp with sweat, but her eyes were open. Really open, clear, and aware in a way they hadn't been in days. And when she saw him, her cracked lips pulled into the ghost of a smile. "Papa," she whispered. "I'm hungry." Caleb dropped to his knees beside her, and this time when the tears came, he didn't try to stop them. "That's the best thing you could have said to me, sweetheart," he managed. "That's the very best thing." Clara stood in the doorway, watching the two of them with an expression she didn't quite manage to keep guarded, something soft and aching and hopeful. All at once, the look of a woman who'd just watched a small miracle happen in her own kitchen and was trying very hard not to let it mean more to her than it should. "I'll get some broth going," she said, her voice rougher than it had been. "And Mr. Whitmore." Caleb looked up. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch," Clara said. "Both of you." By mid-morning, Emma was sitting up against a stack of pillows, color returning to her cheeks. With every spoonful of broth, Sarah coaxed into her, and Caleb had gone out to look over the ranch with Clara at his side. The two of them walking the fence line, while she pointed out where the wire had come loose from winter winds, where the north herd had been giving her trouble, where a section of the barn roof needed shoring up before the fall rains came. She talked cattle and land the way some women talked about their children, with a fierce, protective knowledge that told Caleb everything he needed to know about how she'd managed to hold this place together alone for 5 years when half the territory had bet against her. Folks in town said I'd sell out inside a year after Thomas died. She told him, not looking at him, her eyes on the herd grazing in the middle distance. Said a woman couldn't run 200 head without a man to see to the heavy work. I had bankers coming around every month for the first 2 years, real polite, real concerned for my welfare, all of them hoping I'd get tired enough to sell cheap. She almost smiled. I got real good at telling bankers no. I believe that, Caleb said, and found he meant it as something closer to admiration than politeness. There's men in this territory who still don't like it, Clara went on. A woman running a spread this size doing better than half the outfits around her that are run by men who never missed a meal in their lives. Some folks can't abide seeing that. Makes them feel small, I suppose, watching someone they didn't expect much from turn out to be more than they bargained for. Caleb thought of Harold Whitaker's name, which he'd heard whispered twice already that morning by ranch hands who fell silent whenever Clara came within earshot, a name spoken the way men speak of weather they can see coming, but can't yet do anything about. Somebody in particular, you mean? He asked. Clara's jaw tightened just slightly. There's always somebody in particular, Mr. Whitmore. Man by the name of Harold Whitaker owns the spread bordering mine to the east. He's wanted my land my whole operation, if truth be told, not just the pasture he keeps making offers on since before Thomas was even in the ground. I've turned him down more times than I can count, and he's not a man who takes turning down well. She shook her head as if physically setting the thought aside. But that's a worry for another day. Today, I mean to see whether you can actually ride, or whether that talk of yours about 10 years running your own spread was just a man saying what he figured a desperate woman wanted to hear. There was a challenge in her voice, and something almost like humor beneath it, and Caleb felt something in his chest loosen further. Still the particular relief of a man who'd been carrying the full weight of survival alone for 6 months, and had just been handed, however briefly, the chance to set some of it down. "Ma'am," he said, Give me a horse and I'll show you exactly what 10 years is worth." She did. And by the time the sun stood high overhead, Caleb Whitmore had worked a green colt through paces that made two of Clara's ranch hands stop what they were doing to watch, had mended 40 yards of fence line without being asked twice how it was done, and had earned for the first time in 6 long months something that felt almost like the shape of his old life returning to him. Hard work, honest sweat, and the particular dignity of a man doing a job well and being seen doing it. That evening, with Emma sitting up at the supper table for the first time in days, spooning down a bowl of Sarah's stew with the appetite of a child who'd finally remembered what it felt like to be safe. Caleb allowed himself for one careful moment to hope. He didn't yet know about the whispers already starting in town about the letter that would arrive at the county sheriff's office inside the week, about the particular kind of trouble a man like Harold Whitaker was capable of manufacturing when a widow he wanted refused him one time too many. He didn't know that the peace settling over Blackwood Ranch that evening was the kind that came right before a storm. The deep, deceptive quiet that farmers back in Kansas used to warn him about. The stillness that meant something was building on the horizon, gathering strength, waiting for the wrong moment to break. All Caleb knew, sitting at that long kitchen table with his daughter, laughing, actually laughing for the first time in half a year at some small joke Sarah had made about the ranch dog stealing biscuits, was that for tonight, at least, they had a roof afire and 2 people who'd looked at a desperate stranger pounding on a gate in the rain and chosen without hesitation to let him in. Clara caught his eye across the table, and something passed between them that neither one of them had words for yet. Not quite gratitude, not quite recognition, but something adjacent to both the quiet understanding of 2 people who had each been carrying more than their share of loss, and had just for the first time in years set a small piece of it down in the same room. "Eat up, Mr. Whitmore," she said, nodding toward his still full bowl. "You've got a long day of work ahead of you tomorrow, and I don't abide wasted food any more than I abide wasted effort." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, and picked up his spoon, and for the length of that one warm evening, allowed himself to believe that the worst of the road behind him might finally be behind him for good. He was wrong about that. He wouldn't have to wait weeks to learn it either. Trouble, as it turned out, was already saddling its horse. 4 days passed in a rhythm Caleb had nearly forgotten a man's life could hold. He rose before the sun worked cattle and mended fence until his hands bled fresh calluses over old ones, and came in each evening to find Emma stronger than the day before, first walking to the porch on her own 2 feet, then chasing the ranch dog around the yard with a shriek of laughter that made Sarah drop a whole basket of laundry in surprise. Clara watched the girl's recovery with an intensity Caleb noticed but didn't remark on. She'd stand in the kitchen doorway some evenings, arms crossed, just watching Emma spoon down her supper, and there was a hunger in her expression that had nothing to do with food. On the 5th morning, a rider came up the long drive at a hard trot, and Clara's whole body went rigid the moment she recognized him. "Whitaker," she said under her breath, setting down the bucket she'd been carrying. Caleb straightened from the fence post he'd been setting and got his first look at the man whose name had been spoken like weather in every corner of the ranch. Harold Whitaker rode a tall bay gelding, groomed to a shine that told a man plainer than words how much money sat behind it. He wore a coat too fine for ranch work and a smile too practiced to be trusted. And when he reined up in the yard, he didn't dismount right away. Just sat there looking down at Clara, the way a man looks at something he intends to own, eventually, whether it wants owning or not. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "You're looking well. Ranch looks well, too. Surprising given the trouble you've had keeping hands on." "State your business, Harold, or turn that horse around," Clara said. "I've got work to do and no patience today for whatever you've come to sell me." "Not selling anything." Whitaker's eyes slid to Caleb, taking his measure in one slow pass, the way a man might size up a horse he was thinking of underbidding for. "Buying, actually. Or trying to. I understand you've had a change in circumstances, Mrs. Bennett. New hired man. New arrangement, I hear, involving a child sleeping under your roof." Clara's spine went straight as a fence post. "My arrangements are my own business." "Course they are." Whitaker's smile didn't waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. Though I'd be careful if I were you about what kind of talk that sort of arrangement invites in town. A widow woman unmarried taking a strange man and his child into her home without so much as a chaperone. Folks talk, Mrs. Bennet. Folks talk plenty. Caleb felt heat rise up the back of his neck, but he held his tongue, sensing this wasn't his fight to start. Not yet. Not with Clara standing there with her jaw set like iron. "Let them talk," Clara said. "I've weathered worse talk than that Harold and I expect I'll weather more before I'm through. You didn't ride 4 miles out here to warn me about gossip. Say what you actually came to say." Whitaker's smile finally slipped just at the edges. "I'll renew my offer on the east pasture. Same terms as before. Fair price, cash on delivery, and you keep the rest of your spread free and clear. Man in your position, new mouths to feed a hired hand you barely know could use the extra capital, I'd think. My position is exactly the same as it was the last 3 times you made that offer," Clara said. "Which is to say, not interested. Now get off my land, Harold, before I set the dogs on you." Something flickered across Whitaker's face. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold recalculation. The look of a man revising a plan rather than abandoning it. He gathered his reins and turned the bay gelding, but before he rode off, his eyes cut back to Caleb one more time, lingering there, with an assessment that made the hair on Caleb's arms stand up. "You'd do well to remember, Mrs. Bennet," Whitaker said, "that a woman alone out here is vulnerable in more ways than one. Sometimes the men who come begging at your gate aren't quite what they claim to be. I'd hate to see you burned by misplaced charity." He tipped his hat again, mockingly slow. "Good day to you both." He rode off at an easy canter, unhurried, a man confident his words would do their work, whether or not his boots ever touched Clara's porch again. Caleb watched him go, fists clenched at his sides. "Ma'am, I don't like the way he looked at me." "Neither do I," Clara said quietly. "That's Harold Whitaker's way. He doesn't threaten a body outright that's too plain for him. He plants doubt. Instead, lets it grow on its own waters, it with whatever gossip he can manufacture, and by the time you notice the vine's grown up around your feet, it's too late to cut it loose easy." She turned to Caleb, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw something like fear cross her face, quickly masked. "You should know he's not a man who loses gracefully. I've turned him down 4 times now on that pasture, and each time he's gotten a little more determined, and a good deal less patient about how he goes about getting it." "What's he wanted for so bad, one pasture?" "It's not really about the pasture," Clara said. "It's about a widow woman making a fool of him in front of the whole territory by refusing to sell. Man like Harold can't abide being told no by someone he doesn't think has the right to tell him anything." She shook her head, some of the steel returning to her shoulders. "Don't you worry on it. I've handled Harold Whitaker for 5 years, and I'll handle him a good while longer. Go on and finish that fence line before the light goes." But Caleb noticed in the days that followed that Clara took to locking the front door at night, a habit she hadn't kept before, and that she started keeping the shotgun closer to hand than seemed strictly necessary for chasing off coyotes. The following Saturday, Caleb rode into town with a list from Sarah for supplies: flour coffee, a length of muslin for a dress Emma had outgrown, and got his first real taste of what Clara meant about talk. The general store fell quiet when he walked in. Not silent exactly, but quiet in the particular way of a room where conversation has just been interrupted on purpose. 2 women near the fabric counter exchanged a look he wasn't meant to catch, and the storekeeper, a thin man named Pruitt, eyed him with a wariness that bordered on rude. "You're the one staying out at the Bennet place," Pruitt said, not quite a question. "I'm working for Mrs. Bennet, yes," Caleb said evenly. "Foreman position." Pruitt's eyes flicked toward the 2 women who were making no effort at all now to hide the fact that they were listening. "Folks around here take an interest in the widow Bennet's business. Always have. Woman running a spread that size alone, and now a strange man moved right into her house along with his child. People talk is all I'm saying." "There's a spare room," Caleb said, keeping his voice level, though something hot was climbing his throat. "My daughter was sick when we arrived. Mrs. Bennet took us in out of Christian charity, nothing more, And I'd thank you and anyone else in this town to keep your talk to yourselves and let a decent woman go on running her own ranch in peace. One of the women near the fabric counter, older, sharp-eyed, with the look of someone who'd decided her opinion mattered more than most, spoke up without waiting to be asked. Christian charity. She repeated, a thin smile playing at her mouth. Is that what they're calling it these days? Ma'am, Caleb said, turning to face her fully. I don't believe I caught your name. Mrs. Pemberton, she said, chin lifting. Mrs. Pemberton, my wife died 8 months back, and my daughter near died of fever 4 days ago before Clara Bennett opened her gate to 2 strangers in a rainstorm, and likely saved that child's life. I don't much care what gets said in this store about me. I've had worse said, and by worse men, than any standing here. But I won't stand quiet while somebody sullies the name of a woman who's shown my family nothing but kindness since the moment we arrived. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a list to fill. The store stayed quiet a moment longer, the 2 women exchanging another look. This one considerably less smug than the first, and Pruitt cleared his throat and started pulling items from the shelf without further comment. Caleb rode back to the ranch with the supplies lashed behind his saddle, and a knot of anger sitting hard in his chest that didn't ease the whole way home. He found Clara out by the barn, forking hay into the stalls, and she took one look at his face and set the pitchfork aside. Town wasn't kind, she said. It wasn't a question. Town had plenty to say about you that wasn't its business to say, Caleb replied. I set a few of them straight. Something crossed Clara's face, surprise, and beneath it, something warmer that she tried and failed to keep hidden. You didn't need to do that. Yes, ma'am, I did. Caleb dismounted, unlashing the supplies with hands that were still not quite steady. You took my daughter in when she was dying, and asked nothing of me but honest work in return. I'll not stand by and let a room full of gossips talk about you like you're something shameful for having done it. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and the yard between them went very quiet, filled only with the ordinary sounds of a working ranch, a horse stamping in its stall, a hen clucking somewhere near the coop, the wind moving low through the grass beyond the fence. Nobody's stood up for me like that in a long while, she said finally, her voice rougher than usual. Not since Thomas passed. Man tends to lose his defenders once the one who married him is gone. Then it's past time somebody started again, Caleb said. That evening, after Emma had gone down to sleep and Sarah had retired to her own room off the kitchen, Caleb found Clara sitting alone on the porch steps, watching the last light drain out of the sky over the western ridge. He sat down beside her close enough to talk without shouting far enough to mind his manners, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. I keep thinking on what Harold said, Clara admitted eventually. About charity burning a body. I've been burned before, Mr. Whitmore. Not by charity exactly, but by trusting where trust wasn't earned. I don't intend to make that mistake again. I'm not looking to burn you, ma'am, Caleb said quietly. I'm looking to earn my keep and raise my daughter someplace safe. That's the whole of it. I believe you, Clara said, and there was something almost surprised in her own voice at the admission. That's the strange part. I've had every reason these 5 years to trust nobody who comes asking for anything, and here you are, and I believe every word you've told me. She looked over at him, her pale eyes catching the last of the light. That either makes me a fool, or it means something's different about you than about the others. I'd like to think it's the second one, Caleb said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite peace, but sat somewhere close to both. They stayed on that porch a while longer, talking of small things. The ranch, the weather coming in from the west. Emma's fondness for the barn cats, and neither one of them mentioned Harold Whitaker again that night, though his name sat between them anyway. Unspoken like a storm cloud, neither wanted to name aloud, for fear of calling it closer. Caleb didn't yet know that Whitaker had already ridden to the county seat that same afternoon, that he'd sat in the sheriff's office with a folder of manufactured papers and a story half true and half poison, planting the first seed of an accusation that would take root within the week and threaten to tear apart the fragile peace they'd built in 4 short days. He didn't know that the quiet on that porch, warm and full of unspoken things, was the last quiet he'd have for a good while yet. He only knew that Emma was sleeping sound and fever-free under a roof that wasn't his own, but felt somehow more like home than any roof he'd slept beneath in half a year, and that the woman sitting beside him on the porch steps had looked a desperate stranger in the eye and chosen kindness when every hard lesson of her life had given her good reason to choose otherwise. Later that same week, Caleb came in from the barn to find Emma sitting on the kitchen floor with Clara, the two of them bent over a rag doll Clara had pulled down from some trunk in the attic, Rose's doll. Though Clara didn't say so, and Caleb didn't ask, understanding instinctively that some things were better left unspoken until a body was ready to speak them. "Her name's Bess," Clara was saying, guiding Emma's small fingers through a stitch on the doll's frayed sleeve. "She's had that sleeve torn near a year, and nobody's had the patience to fix her proper. Think you could manage it?" Emma's tongue poked out the corner of her mouth in fierce concentration. "I can sew. Mama taught me before she got sick. Only little stitches, though." "Little stitches are exactly what Bess needs," Clara said, and there was something in her voice, low and careful, that told Caleb she was holding herself together with the same deliberate effort he'd used 100 times these past 6 months. "Your mama sounds like she was a fine teacher." "She was the best teacher," Emma said, matter of fact, in the way only a child could manage grief, stating it plain and moving on to the next stitch without the weight adults carried in such statements. "Papa says I've got her hands. For sewing, I mean. Not for other things." "I believe that," Clara said, and glanced up to find Caleb standing in the doorway watching. Something passed between the two adults over the child's bent head, an understanding neither one had earned the right to name yet, but that sat there plain all the same, warm and fragile and entirely unexpected. That night, once Emma was asleep and the house had gone quiet, Caleb found himself standing outside the spare room a moment longer than necessary, listening to his daughter's steady breathing, before he made his way to his own bed and lay staring up at a ceiling that wasn't his, in a house that wasn't his, belonging to a woman he'd known less than a week and already trusted more than he'd trusted most folks he'd known his whole life. He thought about Mary and the promise he'd made her in that cold February room, and for the first time since her passing, the thought didn't come wrapped entirely in shame. He'd broken pieces of that promise walking half of Montana territory on an empty stomach. But maybe he allowed himself to think, staring up into the dark, a man could start keeping a promise again, even after he'd broken it 100 times over, as long as somebody was willing to open a gate for him when he had nowhere left to knock. Morning came gray and quiet over Blackwood Ranch, the kind of gray that didn't promise rain so much as threaten it, and Caleb was up before the rooster found his voice boots, laced hands already reaching for the fence tools before his mind had fully caught up with the day. Something had settled into him overnight. Not peace exactly, but the shape of it close enough to fool a tired man into resting easier than he had in months. He should have known better. A man who'd lost as much as Caleb had learned sooner or later that peace never arrived without a bill attached. Clara met him at the barn door, sleeves already rolled to the elbow, and there was something tight around her eyes that hadn't been there the evening before. "Sheriff Corwin's riding out this morning," she said, no greeting, first straight to the point the way she always was when something weighed on her. "Send a boy ahead with word. Says he's got questions needs asking." Caleb's stomach dropped clean through the floor. "Questions about what?" "Didn't say, but I've known Dale Corwin 11 years and he doesn't ride 4 miles out of town over nothing." Clara's jaw was set hard, the same iron Caleb had come to recognize as the shape she wore when trouble showed its face. "You didn't do anything, did you, Mr. Whitmore? Anything I ought to know about before he gets here?" "No, ma'am." Caleb met her eyes square, didn't flinch from it. "I've never stole so much as a loaf of bread I didn't earn, not even when Emma and I went 2 days without eating. Whatever this is, it isn't truth." "I believe you," Clara said, and the way she said it, quick, certain, no hesitation at all, loosened something tight in Caleb's chest, even as the rest of him stayed braced for whatever was riding toward them. Sheriff Corwin arrived a little past 9, a heavy-set man with a graying mustache and the tired, patient eyes of a lawman who'd spent 30 years learning that most trouble in a small county came wearing a familiar face. He tipped his hat to Clara, nodded to Caleb, with a wariness that wasn't unkind, but wasn't comfortable either, and didn't waste time getting to his business. "Got a wire from the sheriff's office in Ellis County, Kansas," Corwin said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. Name of Caleb Whitmore came up in connection with an outstanding debt matter. Says here there's a claim you absconded owing money to a man named Silas Reed, took cattle that wasn't yours to take on the way out. The words landed like a fist to Caleb's gut. "That's a lie." "I didn't say it was true," Corwin said evenly. "I said it's what the wire claims. I've got to ask is all. That's my job. Silas Reed was the banker who foreclosed on my farm," Caleb said, his voice shaking now. Anger and fear tangled together so tight he couldn't separate one from the other. "I owed him money, yes, same as half the county owed him money after the drought. But I never took a single head of cattle that wasn't mine. I sold what stock I had, honest paid what I could, and the rest went to the bank same as the land did. There's no theft in that. There's just a man who lost everything he had, and walked away with his daughter and nothing else." Corwin studied him a long moment, the same weighing look Clara had given him that first night at the gate. "Funny thing about that wire," he said slowly. "It didn't come through official channels. Come through a private inquiry paid for by somebody local, wanting information on a man staying out this way. I don't reckon I need to tell either of you who might have gone to that particular trouble." Clara's face had gone pale and furious all at once. "Whitaker!" "Didn't say that," Corwin said, though his eyes said otherwise. "But I'll tell you both plain. I've known Harold Whitaker a long time, and I've known him to bend the truth further than a green willow branch when it suits his purposes. I'm not fixing to arrest a man on the word of a wire that smells this strange. But I'll also tell you, I've got to look into it proper, on account of it being my job, whether I like the smell of it or not. Mr. Whitmore, I'd take it kindly if you didn't go wandering too far from this ranch till I've had a chance to wire Ellis County myself and hear it plain from the source." "I've got a daughter needs a home sheriff," Caleb said. "I'm not going anywhere." "Good." Corwin tipped his hat again, turning his horse. "I'll be in touch, Mrs. Bennett. You take care out here." He rode off, leaving a silence behind him that felt heavier than the gray sky pressing down over the ranch. Caleb stood rooted to the spot, his hands curled into fists at his sides, watching the dust settle where the sheriff's horse had passed. "He's not going to stop," Caleb said quietly. "Whitaker, this is just the start of it, isn't it?" "I expect it is," Clara said, and there was something grim and resolved in her voice, the sound of a woman squaring up for a fight she'd fought before and intended to win again. "But you listen to me, Caleb Whitmore. I've weathered worse men than Harold Whitaker throwing worse things at this ranch, and I'm not about to let a stack of lies chase off the first honest hand I've had working this land in 3 years. You hear me?" "I hear you," Caleb said. "But ma'am, I won't have you dragged through this on my account. If it comes to it, if this gets worse, I'll take Emma and go before I let it cost you your ranch." Clara turned on him so fast he nearly stepped back. "You'll do no such thing. That girl in there just got her health back under my roof. I'll not have her carried back out onto the road because a coward with more money than decency wants to scare a good man off my land. You stay. You hear me? You stay, and we face whatever comes of it together." Something in the way she said together settled into Caleb's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through him. He didn't have words for yet. 3 days passed with no more word from the sheriff. 3 days that should have felt like relief, but instead felt like the particular held-breath quiet before a storm broke loose. Caleb threw himself into the work-mending fence, breaking 2 more colts, helping Clara sort 100 head of cattle for the fall market. But he felt eyes on him everywhere. Now felt the weight of a lie somebody else had built settling over his shoulders like a coat 2 sizes too heavy. Emma at least remained blessedly unaware of the storm gathering around her small world. She'd taken to following Clara around the kitchen and the henhouse with the devoted attachment of a child who'd found, however briefly, the shape of a mother again, and Clara gruff, guarded careful. Clara had softened toward the girl in ways that made Caleb's chest ache to watch. "Miss Clara," Emma said one afternoon, perched on an overturned bucket beside the henhouse, watching Clara gather eggs with the solemn concentration of a child memorizing a sacred rite. Was Rose good at gathering eggs? Clara's hands went still for just a moment. Caleb, mending a hinge nearby, held his breath. She was terrible at it, Clara said finally, and there was a smile in her voice that hadn't been there a heartbeat before. Scared of the hens, something fierce. Used to make me carry the basket while she stood 10 feet back and hollered directions like she was running a cattle drive. Emma laughed, delighted. That's silly. It surely was, Clara agreed. But she had her gifts elsewhere. Could ride a pony better than boys twice her age by the time she was your years. Fearless as anything once she was up on a horse's back. Clara set the basket down and looked at Emma with an expression Caleb had never seen her wear before. Open, unguarded, aching, and grateful all at once. You remind me of her some days. Not in the being scared of hens mind. In the asking questions nobody else thinks to ask. Papa says I ask too many questions, Emma said. Your papa's wrong about that, Clara said. There's no such thing as too many questions, so long as you're brave enough to listen to the answers. Caleb had to turn away from the hinge he was mending, blinking hard against something hot and unexpected gathering behind his eyes. He hadn't realized how much room there still was in a broken heart for more breaking of the good kind, the kind that came from watching two wounded souls find each other's shape in the empty spaces they'd both been carrying alone. The trouble came again on a Thursday, and it came in a form none of them expected. Caleb was out checking the eastern fence line, the same fence that bordered Whitaker's coveted pasture, when he found it. 40 yards of good wire cut clean through in 6 places, and beyond it, hoof prints leading off toward the ridge, where a dozen head of Clara's best breeding stock had clearly been driven off in the night. His blood went cold. He knew standing there in the gray morning light with the cut wire dangling useless in his hands exactly how this would look. A new hired hand. A cloud of suspicion already hanging over him from Kansas. And now missing cattle driven off a fence line he himself had ridden past not 2 days before. He rode back to the house at a dead gallop. Clara! He was off the horse before it had fully stopped, boots hitting the ground hard. Clara! We've got trouble at the east fence. Cattle's missing wires cut clean through. Clara came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, and Caleb watched her face shift through fury and something colder and more calculating in the space of 3 seconds. How many head? Dozen best I could count from the tracks. All from the breeding stock looked like. That's no coincidence, Clara said, already moving toward the barn for her own horse. Whitaker knows exactly what he's doing hitting the breeding stock instead of the general herd. That's the part of my operation that took the longest to build and the hardest to replace. You think it was him? I know it was him, Clara said, swinging up onto her horse with a speed that belied her size. But knowing and proving are 2 different animals. Mr. Whitmore and Harold spent 5 years learning how to make sure the second one never catches up to the first. They rode the fence line together, and Clara's face went hard and still as granite when she saw the cut wire for herself. The tracks leading east toward Whitaker's land, before doubling back north in a wide loop that Caleb recognized immediately for what it was. A deliberate attempt to make the trail confusing enough that no honest tracker could follow it clean to its source. He's covering himself, Clara said grimly. Driving them off, looping the trail, probably got them penned somewhere on his own land already, with a fresh brand halfway burned into their hides by now. What do? We report it to Corwin, Clara said. Not that it'll do much good. Harold's smart enough never to leave his own hands dirty on something like this. But it goes on record, and it's one more piece for the pile when the truth finally comes due. She looked over at Caleb, something sharp and searching in her expression. You understand what he's doing here, don't you? He's not just after my land anymore. He's building a story. New hand shows up with a cloud over his name from Kansas, and not 2 weeks later cattle start disappearing off the very fence line that man's supposed to be tending. Doesn't take much imagination to guess who Harold wants the town believing did this. Caleb felt the floor of his stomach drop out entirely. He's setting me up to take the blame. That's exactly what he's doing, Clara said, and I'll be damned if I let him get away with it." That night the sheriff came again later this time, his face grim in the lantern light as he sat across from them at the kitchen table, where not 2 weeks before, Caleb had first broken down weeping with exhaustion and gratitude. "I've got to be straight with you both," Corwin said. "Word's already moving through town about the missing stock. And with that wire from Kansas still sitting open on my desk, folks are drawing the lines themselves, whether I like it or not." "What lines?" Caleb said, though he already knew. "That you had something to do with it?" Corwin said, not unkind but plain. "I don't believe it myself, mind. Man doesn't work a fence line for 2 weeks straight, earn the trust of half my county's cattlemen with his riding, and then turn around and rustle his own employer's breeding stock right under his own nose. That's not how thieves work, and I've caught plenty in 30 years to know the difference. But belief and proof are different currencies, Mr. Whitmore, and right now, I've got precious little of the second to spend on your behalf." "So what happens now?" Clara demanded. "Now I keep investigating," Corwin said. "I've sent a second wire to Ellis County, this one through proper official channels requesting the original complaint documents instead of second-hand claims. If Silas Reed truly filed a theft complaint, there'll be a paper trail with his signature on it dated and witnessed. If there isn't—" He let the sentence hang meaningful. "Well, that tells its own story about who's really been doing the lying around here." "How long?" Caleb asked. "How long till you know?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending how fast the wire office moves this time of year." Corwin stood gathering his hat. "I know that's not the answer you were hoping for, but I'd rather take 3 weeks and get it right than rush a wrong conclusion that costs an innocent man his freedom and his daughter her father." He paused at the door, looking back at them both. "In the meantime, Mr. Whitmore, I'd keep to the ranch as much as you're able. Less chance for more mischief to get laid at your door if you're not giving anybody the opportunity." After he left the house, sat in a silence so heavy, Caleb thought he might drown in it. Emma had long since gone to sleep, blessedly unaware of the storm building over her small world, and Clara sat across the table from him with her hands wrapped tight around a cup of coffee gone cold an hour before. "I never meant to bring this kind of trouble to your door," Caleb said finally. "You took us in out of kindness, and now you've got a man trying to steal your land and ruin your name on top of it, and it's all on account of me showing up here in the first place." "Don't you dare," Clara said, sharp enough that Caleb sat back in his chair. "Don't you dare sit there and take the blame for Harold Whitaker's rotten character. That man's wanted this ranch since before you ever set foot in this territory. If it wasn't you giving him an excuse, it'd have been something else. Some other lie, some other scheme. Men like Harold don't need real reasons, Mr. Whitmore. They manufacture them, same as they manufacture everything else. Still," Caleb said, "I could take Emma and go, find work somewhere else, somewhere that doesn't put your whole life at risk just for having taken pity on us." Clara reached across the table, then something she hadn't done before, and closed her rough, work-worn hand over his. "I've buried a husband and a daughter both," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I've had every reason in this world to close myself off from anybody else walking through that gate, and I very nearly did. But you and that girl walked into my life 2 weeks ago and reminded me what it feels like to have a full house again, to hear laughter in these rooms instead of just the wind. I'm not giving that up because a bitter, greedy man wants to scare me into it. You're not going anywhere, Caleb. Neither is Emma. We're going to see this through together, whatever it costs." Caleb sat very still, her hand warm and solid over his, and felt something shift inside him that he hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure how to name, something that went beyond gratitude, beyond the simple relief of a desperate man finding shelter. He looked up at her, at the steady certainty in her pale gray eyes, and understood with a clarity that startled him, that somewhere in these 2 short weeks, this woman had stopped being merely his employer and had become something else entirely. Something he didn't yet have the right to call by its true name, but felt anyway sitting there in his chest like a second heartbeat. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name without the courtesy of Mrs. Bennet attached to it, and he watched her notice, watched something flicker across her face at the sound of it. "Yes." "Thank you," he said, though the word felt too small for what he meant by it. For all of it. For opening that gate. For believing me tonight when the whole town's ready to believe otherwise. I don't know how I'll ever repay what you've given us." "You don't repay kindness, Caleb," Clara said softly. "You just pass it on to the next soul that needs it. That's the only currency that matters out here." She withdrew her hand, then the moment passing, but not fully gone, and rose to bank the fire for the night. And Caleb watched her move around the kitchen with an ache in his chest. He hadn't felt since Mary was alive. The particular terrifying ache of a man who was starting against every hard lesson his life had taught him to hope for something more than mere survival. The weeks that followed tested that hope at every turn. Word of the missing cattle spread through the county faster than Corwin's wires could travel, and every trip into town brought Caleb face to face with a fresh wave of suspicion. Storekeepers who watched his hands too closely. Women who pulled their children a little nearer when he passed. Whispers that followed him down the boardwalk like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Twice more small acts of sabotage struck the ranch. A gate left open that let a dozen cattle wander onto the open range. A water trough fouled with something that sickened 3 head before Clara caught it in time. Each incident small enough to avoid outright proof, large enough to keep the cloud of suspicion thick and low over Caleb's head. The water trough incident happened on a Tuesday, and Caleb was the one who found it kneeling at the edge of the stock pond behind the north pasture at first light to check on 3 head that had gone off their feed the night before. 2 of them were down in the grass sides, heaving foam gathered thick and wrong at their mouths, and the third stood swaying on unsteady legs, eyes rolled back white at the edges. "Clara!" He was running before he'd finished shouting her name, boots skidding in the wet grass. "Clara, get out here, something's wrong with the stock." She came at a dead run, skirts hitched up in one fist, and dropped to her knees beside the nearest animal, with the same swift competence she'd shown that first night over Emma's sickbed. "Lie," she said after a moment, sniffing at the water's edge, her face going hard and cold. "Somebody's put lye in this trough. Not enough to kill outright, but enough to sicken bad." She was up and moving again, shouting orders toward the barn. "Get fresh water down here now and the charcoal from the smokehouse quick as you can carry it." They worked through the morning, saving what stock they could. Caleb's hands raw from hauling buckets, Clara forcing charcoal slurry down 3 sick animals' throats, with a patience that belied the fury simmering plain beneath her calm. By noon, 2 of the 3 had steadied. The third didn't make it. Clara stood over the dead animal a long moment, her jaw working, saying nothing at all, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out low and dangerous, in a way Caleb hadn't heard from her before. "That's Bluebell's calf," she said. "Bred her myself 3 years running to get that bloodline right. Whitaker didn't just cost me an animal this morning, Caleb. He cost me years of work I can't get back with any amount of money." "We can't prove it was him," Caleb said quietly, though every word tasted like ash in his mouth even as he said it. "No," Clara agreed. "We can't. That's the whole rotten genius of it. He never has to dirty his own hands, never has to leave a single mark that points back to his door. He just keeps chipping away piece by piece, patient as a man carving a tombstone, until there's nothing left standing for him to have to fight for." That same week, Caleb rode into town again for supplies and found Clara had come along this time, unwilling any longer to let him face the whispers alone. They were standing outside the Mercantile Arms full of goods when Mrs. Pemberton crossed the street directly toward them, 2 other women trailing in her wake like ducklings behind a particularly self-satisfied hen. "Mrs. Bennett," Pemberton said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the men loafing outside the saloon. "I do hope your stock troubles have settled. Terrible thing losing animals like that. Almost makes a body wonder if there isn't some manner of curse settled over that ranch of yours lately." "The only curse I've noticed, Mrs. Pemberton," Clara said, not missing a beat, "is the particular kind of small-minded gossip that seems to follow certain folks around this town like flies to a dead thing. Funny how that curse only seems to bite right after Harold Whitaker's been by my place making offers I've turned down flat." Pemberton's smile thinned considerably. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I'm sure you don't," Clara said, sweet as poisoned honey. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we've got a ranch to run. which is more than I can say for some folks around here who seem to have nothing better to occupy their days than counting other people's business for them. She swept past without waiting for a reply, and Caleb, following a step behind, caught the flash of something like admiration on the faces of two men watching from the saloon porch. Men who'd worked cattle themselves and knew exactly what kind of woman it took to run 200 head, alone for 5 hard years, whatever the gossips in town wanted to whisper about it. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said once they were clear of the street loading the wagon. "Yes, I did," Clara said. "A woman who lets folks like Pemberton walk over her once finds them walking over her every day after. I learned that lesson the hard way after Thomas passed. I don't intend to relearn it now." She glanced sideways at him, something almost mischievous flickering across her tired face. "Besides, felt good saying it out loud in front of half the town. Been holding my tongue on Harold Whitaker for 5 years out of some fool notion it wasn't ladylike to speak plain. I'm done holding it." Caleb laughed, the sound surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise her, and for just a moment, standing there loading feed sacks in the gray afternoon light, with suspicion hanging over his name, and a dead calf buried that same morning, he felt something close to lightness settle over him. The particular fragile joy of two people finding a reason to smile in the middle of a fight neither one of them had asked for. Through it all, Clara never wavered. She stood beside him in town when the whispers grew too loud to ignore, met Mrs. Pemberton's poisonous smiles with a steel-eyed calm that made the older woman's composure crack more than once, and refused flatly and repeatedly every fresh offer Whitaker sent through intermediaries to buy the East pasture at a price that climbed higher with each refusal, as though money alone might yet solve what threats and sabotage had failed to accomplish. "He's getting desperate," Clara observed one evening reading over the latest offer with an expression somewhere between contempt and grim satisfaction. "This is nearly double what that pasture's worth on paper. A man doesn't offer that kind of money unless he's running low on other ways to get what he wants. Or unless he knows something's coming that'll make the land worth even more," Caleb said quietly. "Something he wants secured before it happens." Clara looked up at him, something sharpening in her gaze. "What are you thinking?" "I don't rightly know yet," Caleb admitted. "Just a feeling. Man like that doesn't throw good money after bad without a reason. Maybe it's time we started asking around a little ourselves, quiet-like. Careful about what Harold Whitaker's really after, out past that pasture line." It was Emma, of all people, who cracked the first real piece of that mystery loose, though none of them understood the weight of it at the time. She'd taken to spending afternoons at the small ranch schoolhouse 2 miles down the road. Once Clara insisted the girl was strong enough for lessons again, and one evening she came home chattering about a new friend, a boy named Tommy, whose father worked as a surveyor. "Tommy says his papa's been out measuring land past Mr. Whitaker's place for weeks and weeks." Emma reported over supper, entirely unaware of the way both adults at the table had gone suddenly sharply still. "Says they're gonna build something big. A railroad, maybe. Tommy doesn't know for sure. But his papa's been paid an awful lot of money to keep quiet about it, and Tommy heard him say the word railroad twice when he thought nobody was listening." Caleb and Clara exchanged a look across the table that carried the full weight of understanding. Neither one wanted to speak aloud in front of the child. A railroad line. Land values about to explode overnight for whoever held the right acreage when the surveyors finished their work and the announcement finally came. And Harold Whitaker, 5 years patient and suddenly desperate all at once, sitting on a fortune in waiting. If he could just pry Clara's east pasture likely dead center on whatever route those surveyors were charting out of her stubborn, unwilling hands before the truth became public and the price climbed beyond even his reach. "That's it," Clara breathed once Emma had been sent off to wash up for bed out of earshot. "That's what this has all been about. Not just spite, not just wanting to best a widow woman who wouldn't sell. He knew. He's known for months, maybe longer, and every scheme, every lie, every head of cattle he's had driven off my land has been aimed at scaring me into selling before I ever learned the truth of what that land's about to be worth. We need proof." Caleb said, his mind already racing ahead. "Not a 5-year-old second-hand gossip from a schoolyard friend. Real proof. Survey documents railroad correspondence, something with names and dates that Corwin can take to a judge. And where do you propose we find that? Clara asked. Caleb met her eyes across the table, and for the first time since Sheriff Corwin had ridden out with his grim wire from Kansas, he felt something other than fear settle into his chest. Something sharper, more purposeful. The particular steadiness of a man who'd finally found the shape of the fight he was in, and knew at last where to aim his next blow. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I intend to find out. Whitaker spent weeks trying to bury me under lies and stolen cattle. Maybe it's past time somebody started digging up truths of his instead. Later, after Clara had gone up to check on Emma one last time, Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table, turning the pieces over in his mind. The wire from Kansas that smelled of manufactured lies, the cut fence and the missing stock, the lie in the trough, and now a railroad line that could turn a stubborn widow's stubborn pasture into a fortune overnight for whichever man managed to pry it loose first. Every piece fit together too neatly to be coincidence, and yet not one piece of it taken alone would hold up in front of a judge. Whitaker had built his whole scheme the way a careful man built a fence post by post, each one solid enough on its own, invisible as a whole, until a body stood back far enough to see the shape it made. Clara came back down a few minutes later, moving quiet, so as not to wake the girl sleeping easy upstairs, and found Caleb still sitting there in the lamplight, his jaw set with the particular stubbornness of a man who'd decided something and wasn't inclined to be talked out of it. "You're planning something," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "I'm planning to find out exactly how far that railroad line runs and exactly who's known about it longest," Caleb said. "A surveyor doesn't work alone out here, not on a job that size. Somebody in this county's been paid to keep quiet, and paid men talk sooner or later if the right question gets asked the right way. And you mean to be the one asking." "I mean for both of us to be," Caleb said, meeting her eyes. "This isn't my fight alone anymore, Clara. Been thinking that from the start, if I'm honest, ever since that first night at your gate. But I'm done thinking it. This is our fight now, however it plays out." Something moved behind Clara's pale gray eyes. Then something warm and startled and entirely unguarded, the look of a woman who'd spent 3 long years learning to expect nothing from the world beyond what she could wrest from it with her own 2 hands, and had just been handed something unexpected and precious instead. "Our fight," she repeated softly, testing the shape of the words. "I like the sound of that a good deal more than I probably should." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters with a low, restless moan that seemed to carry the whole territory's held breath inside it and far off toward the ridge separating Blackwood Ranch from Whitaker Land. A single lantern moved through the darkness, slow, deliberate, and entirely unaware that the 2 people it was meant to frighten had just stopped being afraid. The surveyor's name was Elias Grant, and it took Caleb the better part of 2 days asking careful roundabout questions at the feed store and the livery before he found a man willing to point him toward the small line shack Grant used as a base camp out past the ridge. Clara had wanted to ride out with him that first morning, but they'd argued it through at the kitchen table until she'd finally grudgingly agreed that a lone rancher's wife visiting a strange man's camp would draw exactly the kind of talk neither of them could afford right now, while a hired hand asking after honest work drew none at all. "You go careful," she'd told him, pressing a folded bill into his palm before he mounted up. "And you come back before dark. I mean it, Caleb." "Yes, ma'am," he'd said, and something in the way she'd looked at him, then worry plain and unguarded on her face, had stayed with him the whole ride out. Grant turned out to be a thin, nervous man in his 40s. Spectacles perched crooked on his nose, and when Caleb rode up on the pretense of asking after work, the surveyor's hands had gone white-knuckled around his own coffee cup before Caleb had even dismounted. "Ain't hiring," Grant said too fast. "Job's already got its crew. Didn't come asking for work exactly," Caleb said, keeping his voice easy, unhurried, the same voice he'd have used gentling a spooked colt. "Came asking about the railroad." Grant's face went the color of old ash. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Caleb said. "And I think you've been paid a good deal of money to keep not knowing about it, which tells me somebody's awful. worried what happens if the wrong person finds out too soon. "I'm not here to cause you trouble, Mr. Grant. I'm here because a good woman's about to lose land. She spent 5 years fighting to keep on account of lies somebody's telling about me and sabotage somebody's working against her. And I've got a strong feeling both of those things trace back to whatever it is you're not supposed to be talking about." Grant sat very still for a long moment, his coffee going cold in his shaking hand. "I've got a family too," he said, finally quiet. "Wife and 3 kids back in Bozeman. Man who's paying me made it plain what happens to a surveyor's contract, and maybe worse than that if word gets out early." "Whitaker," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Grant's silence was answer enough. "I'm not asking you to say his name out loud where it can be traced back to you," Caleb said carefully. "I'm asking if there's paper, survey maps, correspondence, something that shows the route, shows who's known about it and for how long. Something I could take to a sheriff without ever having to say where I got it." Grant's jaw worked for a long moment, some private battle playing out behind his frightened eyes. Then slowly, he reached into a canvas satchel hanging from a nail inside the shack door and pulled out a folded map, creased soft from handling, and set it on the table between them without a word. Caleb unfolded it with careful hands. The proposed rail line ran clean and unmistakable through the heart of Blackwood Ranch's east pasture, and dated in the corner 3 months back was a set of survey notes signed by Grant himself, and beneath his signature in a different hand, a second notation, reading confirmed per H. Whitaker, additional compensation authorized. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. "This is dated 3 months ago," he said, "before I ever set foot in this territory. Man's been planning this a long while," Grant said. "Longer than 3 months if you want my honest guess. He's had his eye on that pasture since before his wife left him, and that was going on 4 years back now." "Can I take this?" Caleb asked. Grant hesitated, fear plain on his thin face. "If it gets traced back to me." "It won't," Caleb said. "I give you my word on that. I'll say I found it lost, blown off somewhere near the fence line. Nobody needs to know it ever passed through your hands." Grant studied him a long moment, then nodded once sharp and final, the look of a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long alone. "Take it," he said. "And Mr. Whitmore, whatever you're planning to do with it, do it quick. Whitaker's not a patient man, and he's getting less patient by the week. Man like that cornered tends to get dangerous before he gets honest." Caleb rode back to the ranch with the map folded tight inside his coat, his heart hammering the whole way, and found Clara waiting on the porch exactly where she'd promised to be, watching the road with an anxiety she didn't bother hiding when she saw him coming. "Well?" she called before he'd even swung down from the saddle. He didn't answer with words. He just pulled the folded map from his coat and held it up and watched her face transform as she understood what she was looking at. "Lord above," she breathed, taking it from him with hands that trembled slightly. "This is it. This is everything, Caleb." Dates his name, his own hand practically confessing to the whole scheme. "It's a start," Caleb said. "Corwin's still going to need more than one map to build a case that holds up. But it's a start, and it's proof. Whitaker's known about that railroad for months, which means every offer he's made, every threat, every head of cattle he's had, run off it all. Points back to a man trying to steal land he already knew was about to be worth a fortune." Clara looked up from the map, her eyes bright with something fierce and hopeful that Caleb hadn't seen in her since the night Emma's fever broke. "We're going to beat him," she said. "I can feel it, Caleb. For the first time since Harold rode up that drive threatening me with pretty words, I can feel we're actually going to beat him." They rode into town together that same evening to bring the map straight to Sheriff Corwin, too eager and too frightened of what another night might bring to wait until morning. But the ride into town would prove to be the last easy thing that happened for either of them for a long while yet, because word travels strange and fast in a small county, and somewhere between the Line Shack and Blackwood Ranch, somebody had already carried word to Harold Whitaker that a hired hand had been seen riding out to visit his surveyor. Corwin took the map with a low whistle of surprise, spreading it flat across his desk under the lamplight, his tired eyes tracing the route and the damning notation beneath Grant's signature with the careful attention of a lawman who understood exactly what he was looking at. "Well, I'll be," he said finally. "This changes things considerable. Where'd you come by it?" "Found it," Caleb said, keeping his voice steady. "Blown up against the fence line out past the ridge." Corwin's eyes flickered up to him sharp and knowing, but he didn't press the point. "Convenient win that." "Awful convenient," Caleb agreed. "Well?" Corwin folded the map carefully, tucking it into a drawer he locked with a small brass key. "This is real evidence, Mr. Whitmore. First real evidence I've had in this whole mess that points anywhere but toward you. Combined with what I've already got, building from Ellis County got a wire back today, matter of fact, confirming there's no official theft complaint on file against you. Not now, not ever. Which means that First Wire was exactly the kind of manufactured trouble I suspected it was. From the start, I'd say we're getting close to something a judge might actually take serious." "How close?" Clara asked. "Give me another week," Corwin said. "Maybe less. I want to talk to this surveyor myself, official like get a sworn statement if he'll give one. I want to pull records on who's been paying his wages beyond his regular contract. Build it proper, so when we bring this in front of a judge, there's no crack in it. Whitaker's lawyer can pry open." They rode home that night, lighter than they had in weeks. The map safely locked away, real proof finally sitting on a sheriff's desk, instead of just suspicion and instinct. And for the length of that dark ride back toward Blackwood Ranch, Caleb allowed himself cautiously to believe the worst might finally be behind them. He was wrong, and he'd know just how wrong before the sun rose twice more. They found the barn burning at 2 in the morning. Caleb woke to Clara's screaming, a sound so raw and terrified it tore him out of sleep, and had him running before his eyes had even fully adjusted to the dark. And when he burst out onto the porch, he saw the whole eastern sky lit up orange and roaring flames already climbing high through the barn roof. Horses screaming inside, and Clara already halfway across the yard in her nightclothes running straight toward the fire, with nothing but pure animal terror driving her forward. "Clara, no!" Caleb caught her arm, hauled her back with every ounce of strength he had. "The horses. I'll get the horses. You stay clear." "That's my whole herd's winter feed in there," she screamed, fighting against his grip. "Caleb, let me go." "I'll get what I can," he shouted over the roar of the flames. "You go wake Sarah. Get water going. Get the bucket line started. Clara, I need you thinking, not burning yourself alive in there. Do you hear me?" Something in his voice broke through her panic, and she nodded sharp and fast and turned to run for the house. Caleb plunged into the barn through smoke thick enough to blind him, found the first stall by touch and memory alone, threw the latch and slapped the terrified animal's flank hard enough to send it bolting for the open door. He did it again and again, choking on smoke that seared his lungs raw until 4 horses had bolted clear, and his own vision had gone swimming in gray at the edges, and it was only Clara's hands hauling him bodily back out through the door screaming his name that got him clear before the roof came down in a shower of sparks and burning timber. He lay in the dirt of the yard, coughing up smoke, Clara's hands frantic on his face, checking him for burns, with a desperation that told him plainer than any words could have exactly how frightened she'd been. "You fool man," she was saying, half sobbing, half furious. "You absolute fool, you could have died in there." "Horses are out," Caleb managed between coughs. "All 4. That's what matters." "You're what matters," Clara said fiercely, and then as if the words had escaped before she'd meant to let them. She went very still, staring down at him in the flickering orange light, and something passed between them that neither one of them had spoken aloud yet. But both of them, in that raw and terrified moment, could no longer pretend wasn't there. The barn burned to its foundation before the sun came up. Corwin arrived at first light to find the wreckage still smoking, and his face went hard and grim as he walked the perimeter, crouching here and there to examine the ground. "Coal oil," he said finally, straightening up with a scrap of soaked burlap in his gloved hand. "Somebody splashed this along the south wall and set it alight deliberate. This wasn't any accident, Mrs. Bennett. This was arson, plain and simple." "Whitaker," Clara said, her voice shaking with a fury Caleb had never heard from her before. "I can't prove that yet," Corwin said. "But I'll tell you this, a man doesn't burn a barn down over a business dispute unless he's running scared, and scared men make mistakes. This is the biggest mistake Harold Whitaker's made yet, whether he knows it or not, because arson's a hanging offense in this territory. And if I can tie this back to him, no amount of money's going to buy his way clear of it. But proving it, as always, remained the impossible knot at the center of everything. And 3 days later, that knot pulled devastatingly tight in a direction none of them had seen coming. Caleb was mending what fence remained near the burned-out barn when 2 riders came up the drive at a hard, purposeful trot, and his stomach dropped the moment he recognized Corwin's badge glinting in the morning light beside him and beside the sheriff. A second man Caleb didn't recognize, wearing a deputy's star and a grim, apologetic expression that told Caleb everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. "Caleb Whitmore," Corwin said, and his voice carried none of the warmth it had held 3 nights before over that map spread across his desk. "I've got to place you under arrest." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. "What sheriff? What in God's name?" "Witness came forward this morning," Corwin said, and Caleb could hear the reluctance in every word, could see plain on the older man's face that he didn't believe what he was being forced to do. "Says he saw you near the barn the night it burned coal oil can in your hand. Signed statement sworn before a judge in the county seat not 3 hours ago." "That's a lie." Caleb's voice cracked with the force of his own disbelief. "I was inside my own bed when that fire started, Clara can tell you. She's the one you'd be protecting either way, wouldn't she?" The deputy said, not unkindly, but plain. "Woman in love with a man's got every reason to swear to whatever keeps him free." Clara came running from the house at the sound of raised voices, her face going white as bone when she saw what was happening. "This is madness. Caleb never left that house all night. I'll swear to it on anything you like." "I believe you'd swear to it, ma'am," Corwin said heavily. "That's exactly the trouble. Judge Ashford's already seen the sworn statement, and he's ordered the arrest on the strength of it. I don't have a choice in this, Mrs. Bennet, much as I might wish I did." He looked at Caleb, real sorrow plain in his weathered face. "I'm sorry, son. I truly am, but I've got to take you in." Emma's scream tore through the yard before anyone saw her coming, small and fast and utterly heedless of everything but the sight of her father with his hands being bound by a stranger's rope. "Papa!" She was running full speed, her small face contorted with a terror too large for her body to hold. "Papa, don't let them take you, Papa." Caleb dropped to his knees, despite the ropes already tightening around his wrists, catching her as she crashed into him and held her as tight as his bound hands would allow. His own face wet with tears, he made no effort to hide. "Listen to me, sweetheart," he said, his voice shaking but fierce with a father's desperate need to shield his child from a truth too enormous for her years. "This is a mistake, a bad, terrible mistake, but it's going to get fixed. You hear me? You stay here with Clara. You mind her same as you'd mind me, and I promise you on your mother's grave, I am coming back to you." "You promised, Mama, you'd never let me go without—" Emma sobbed. "You promised." "And I'm not breaking that promise," Caleb said, holding her face in his bound hands, forcing his voice steady through the storm raging inside him. "Not now, not ever. Clara's going to take care of you, and I'm going to fight this, and I am coming home. Do you understand me, Emma? I am coming home." The deputy pulled him to his feet, gentler than his job required, but firm all the same, and led him toward the waiting horses. Clara caught Emma as the girl tried to run after him again, holding the sobbing child tight against her own chest. Her pale gray eyes locked on Caleb's over the top of Emma's head with a fury and a promise that needed no words at all. "I'll fix this," Clara called after him, her voice breaking on the words, even as she forced them out steady and strong. "Caleb Whitmore, do you hear me? I will fix this if it's the last thing I do." "I know you will," Caleb called back, and then the deputy was mounting him up and leading his horse away down the long drive. And the last thing Caleb saw before the ranch fell out of sight behind the ridge was Clara Bennet standing in the ashes of her burned barn, holding his weeping daughter against her chest, her spine straight as iron, despite everything the morning had cost her. The jail in town held exactly 2 cells, and Caleb spent that first night in the smaller of them, staring up at a ceiling he couldn't see in the dark, replaying every moment of the arrest until his mind ached from it. He knew Whitaker's hand was behind the false witness, the same way he'd known Whitaker's hand was behind the cut fence, and the poisoned trough and the burned barn. But knowing and proving remained as always, two entirely separate animals. And now the stakes of that gap had grown large enough to swallow the rest of his life whole. Corwin visited him the next morning, sliding a plate of food through the bars, with an expression that carried more guilt than any lawman ought to feel over doing his sworn duty. "I don't believe it," Corwin said quietly, once the deputy had stepped out of earshot. "Not for 1 minute, Whitmore. But the witness's statement is sworn and signed, and Judge Ashford's already scheduled a hearing for 1 week out. I need something solid to bring before that judge, or this is going to go worse for you than either of us wants to think about." "Who's the witness?" Caleb demanded. "Whitaker wouldn't dirty his own hands testifying himself. Who'd he pay to say they saw me?" "Man by the name of Silas Cobb," Corwin said. "Drifter works odd jobs around the county when he's not drinking his wages away at the saloon. Not the most reliable character I've ever put stock in, if I'm honest, but his statement's detailed enough to hold up unless somebody can poke a real hole in it." "Then let's poke one," Caleb said, leaning forward against the bars with an intensity that surprised even himself. "Where was this Cobb supposedly standing when he claims he saw me? What time? What was the moon doing that night? Was there enough light to see a man's face clear across a burning barnyard at 2 a.m? Something sharpened in Corwin's tired eyes. "That's good thinking, son. That's exactly the kind of thinking a defense needs." He straightened, tucking his hat back on. "I'll start pulling on those threads myself, and I expect Mrs. Bennet won't be sitting idle either, not from what I know of her character." He was right about that. Clara arrived that same afternoon, Emma's small hand clutched tight in hers, and the sight of his daughter's tear-streaked, exhausted face through the bars nearly broke Caleb clean in half. "Papa," Emma whispered, pressing her small fingers through the gap between the bars, and Caleb caught them and held on like a drowning man holding a rope. "I'm all right, sweetheart," he said, though his voice shook with the lie of it. "I'm going to be just fine. You've been minding Clara." "I made her promise not to burn your supper," Emma said with the fierce, wounded seriousness of a child trying desperately to hold her world together through sheer determination alone. "So you'd have something good to eat when you come home." "That's my girl," Caleb said, and had to look away for a moment to keep from breaking down entirely. Clara waited until Emma had wandered a few steps off to examine the sheriff's dusty collection of wanted posters before she leaned close to the bars, her voice dropping low and fierce. "I've been asking around about this Silas Cobb," she said. "And Caleb, you're not going to believe what I found. Man's been seen twice this past week drinking at the saloon on money he had no business having, and one of the barkeeps swears he heard Cobb bragging 3 sheets to the wind about coming into a stroke of good fortune from a certain wealthy rancher who needed a favor." Caleb's pulse quickened. "Would this barkeep swear to that in front of a judge?" "He might," Clara said, "if the price was right and if he wasn't too frightened of Harold Whitaker's reach to say it out loud. I've got 1 week to find out which way that particular coin's going to land, and I intend to spend every hour of it making certain it lands the right way. Clara." Caleb caught her hand through the bars, his voice dropping to something raw and unguarded. "You don't have to fight this battle. It's mine to fight. You stopped being alone in your battles the night you fell through my gate," Clara said fiercely, "and I'll thank you not to insult either one of us by pretending otherwise now. You are not facing this alone, Caleb Whitmore, not while I've got breath left in me to do something about it." She squeezed his hand once hard and then straightened, calling Emma back to her side, and Caleb watched them go with his heart torn wide open, equal parts terror for what the coming week might bring, and something fiercer and more hopeful than terror born of watching a woman who'd already buried everything she loved, once refuse flatly and completely to let it happen a second time. 1 week. 1 week to prove a lie for what it was to save a man's freedom and a child's father and a widow's ranch, all in the same desperate stroke. Clara wasted no time. The very next morning she left Emma in Sarah's care and rode into town alone, tying her horse outside the saloon, with a grim determination that drew more than a few curious stares from men loafing on the boardwalk. She'd never once in 5 years set foot inside that particular establishment, and the barkeep, a broad-shouldered man named Otis Reyes, looked up from his polishing with open surprise when she pushed through the swinging doors. "Mrs. Bennet." He set down his rag slowly. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure of your custom before." "You haven't," Clara said, crossing the sawdust floor with her chin high, ignoring the handful of afternoon drinkers who'd gone quiet at her entrance. "And I'm not here for whiskey, Mr. Reyes. I'm here about Silas Cobb." Something careful moved behind the barkeep's eyes. "Don't know as I've got much to say about Cobb. I heard different," Clara said, keeping her voice low, steady, pitched only for him. "I heard he's been in here twice this week spending money he didn't have a week before, and bragging while he did it about a certain wealthy man who paid him handsome for a favor. I need to know if that's true, Mr. Reyes, and I need to know if you'd be willing to say so in front of a judge." Reyes glanced towards the drinkers at the far end of the bar, lowered his own voice to match hers. "Mrs. Bennet, a man in my business learns quick not to go repeating things he overhears drunk men say. Bad for business testifying against folks with money and reach." "A man's life is at stake," Clara said. "An innocent man sitting in a cell right now on account of a lie your customer told for coin. I understand you've got a business to protect, Mr. Reyes, but I'd ask you to consider what kind of a man you want to be able to look at in the mirror come Sunday morning." Reyes was quiet a long moment, his jaw working. Then he glanced once more toward the far end of the bar and leaned in closer still. "Cobb came in Tuesday night," he said, barely above a whisper. "Threw down a $10 gold piece like it was nothing. Bought a round for half the room. When I asked him where a drifter came into that kind of money, he laughed and said something about doing a favor for a rich man who needed a story told right. Didn't say a name outright. But he did say the man owned half the east side of the county, and there's only one fella around here fits that description close enough to matter." Clara's pulse quickened. "Would you swear to that before Judge Ashford under oath?" Reyes hesitated, real fear flickering across his broad face. "Whitaker's got a long reach, Mrs. Bennet. Man could ruin me easy as blinking if he took a mind to." "And an innocent man could hang if you don't," Clara said quietly. "I won't pretend there's no risk in it, Mr. Reyes. But I'll tell you this, I've stood up to Harold Whitaker for 5 years now, alone with nothing but stubbornness and a shotgun to my name, and I'm still standing. You wouldn't be alone in this either. I'd stand right beside you every step." Something shifted in the barkeep's expression, not quite courage, but the beginning shape of it. The look of a man weighing his fear against something heavier still. "I'll think on it," he said finally. "That's all I can promise you today." "That's more than I had walking in here," Clara said. "Thank you, Mr. Reyes." She left the saloon with her heart hammering one thin thread of hope, pulled a little tighter, and rode straight for the jail to share what she'd learned, only to find Harold Whitaker himself, waiting on the boardwalk outside, leaning against a porch post, with the easy, insufferable confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "Mrs. Bennet," he said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Fancy meeting you in town. Come to visit your hired man in his new lodgings." "Get out of my way, Harold," Clara said, not slowing her stride. "I heard about the barn," Whitaker said, falling into step beside her uninvited. "Terrible tragedy. A woman alone out there losing so much in one season, the stock, the barn, and now her foreman sitting behind bars for arson. Folks are saying you might finally be ready to reconsider my offer on that east pasture. Might be wise given how things are trending for you lately." Clara stopped dead in the street and turned to face him fully, and something in her expression made even Whitaker's practiced smile falter just slightly. "You listen to me, and you listen good," she said, her voice low and shaking with barely restrained fury. "I know what you did. The fence, the trough, the cattle, that barn. And I know exactly what you paid Silas Cobb to say about a man who never left his own bed the night my barn burned. You've made a fool's mistake this time, Harold, thinking you could buy a lie big enough to hang an innocent man and walk away clean. Men who set fires and buy false witnesses don't get to stand on a boardwalk in broad daylight forever pretending they're respectable. That kind of rot always finds its way to the surface eventually." Whitaker's smile had gone entirely cold now, all pretense of courtesy stripped away. Careful, Mrs. Bennet. Making accusations like that without proof could be construed as slander. I'd hate to see you facing a lawsuit on top of everything else you've got piled up against you this season. Try it, Clara said. Go on and try it, Harold. I've got nothing left to lose that you haven't already tried to take from me, and a woman with nothing left to lose is a considerably more dangerous thing to threaten than you seem to realize. She left him standing there on the boardwalk, his composure visibly rattled for the first time since Caleb had watched him ride away from the ranch that first morning weeks before, and hurried on toward the jail, with her pulse still hammering from the confrontation. One small, fierce satisfaction burning steady beneath the fear. The satisfaction of a woman who had finally, after 5 long years, said every single thing to Harold Whitaker's face, that she'd been swallowing down out of some misplaced notion of propriety. She found Caleb pressed against the bars the moment she walked in, reading the whole confrontation plain on her flushed, determined face before she'd said a single word. "You saw him," Caleb said. "Whitaker." "I saw him," Clara confirmed, and told him everything: the barkeep, the gold piece, the confrontation on the boardwalk, while Caleb listened with his hands white-knuckled around the bars, hope and fear warring plain across his exhausted face. "If Reyes testifies," Caleb said slowly, "if he's willing to say what he told you in front of Ashford under oath, then Cobb's story falls apart," Clara finished. "And once one lie cracks the whole rotten structure Whitaker's built starts coming down with it. I believe that, Caleb. I have to believe that." "1 week," Caleb said quietly, echoing the words that had been circling his mind through every long, dark hour since the cell door closed behind him. "1 week," Clara agreed, gripping his hand through the bars one last time before visiting hours ran out. "And I intend to spend every single hour of it fighting for you, same as you'd have fought for me." That night, alone in the dark of his cell, Caleb allowed himself for the first time since the ropes had gone around his wrists to think clearly about what Whitaker had actually done. Cut fence, poisoned water, stolen cattle, burned barn. A false witness bought and paid for with money. Whitaker could afford to spend precisely because he knew what that railroad line was about to make his fortune worth. Every single act traced back thread by thread to one desperate man's determination to take by force, and lies what Clara Bennet had refused 5 separate times to sell him honestly. And now Caleb understood with a clarity that steadied something deep inside his chest. Despite the iron bars surrounding him, Whitaker had made his first real mistake. Arson and false testimony weren't the same as cattle sabotage or manufactured gossip. They were crimes serious enough to hang a man if the truth ever came fully into the light, and a man desperate enough to commit crimes that serious was a man who'd finally overreached, finally left tracks solid enough that even his money and his careful patience might not be able to erase them in time. Somewhere out past the jailhouse window, past the sleeping town, and the dark ridge separating Blackwood Ranch from Whitaker's land. Caleb knew Clara was awake too, working through the night by lamplight, the same way she'd worked through that first terrible night. Nursing Emma's fever, refusing to surrender an inch of ground to a fight that had chosen her whether she'd asked for it or not. 1 week to prove a lie for what it was to save a man's freedom and a child's father and a widow's ranch, all in the same desperate stroke. And somewhere in the darkness of that jail cell, Caleb Whitmore closed his eyes and prayed for the first time since Mary's death, that the Lord who'd let so much be taken from him, already, might yet see fit to leave him this one thing standing. The week passed slower than any week Caleb had ever lived through, each day measured out in the narrow strip of sunlight that crept across his cell floor and vanished again by evening. And by the 4th day, he'd nearly convinced himself that hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. Then Clara came through the jailhouse door with a look on her face that changed everything. "Reyes will testify," she said, before she'd even crossed the room, her voice pitched low with barely restrained excitement. "He came to me himself this morning, Caleb. Said he couldn't sleep right knowing an innocent man might hang on account of his silence. He's agreed to swear before Judge Ashford exactly what he told me, the money, the bragging, all of it." Caleb's hands gripped the bars so hard his knuckles went white. "You're certain, certain as I can be about anything in this world," Clara said. "There's more too." Corwin's been digging at the timeline Cobb gave in his statement, same as you suggested. Turns out there wasn't but a sliver of moon that night, barely enough light to see your own hand in front of your face, let alone a man's features clear across a burning barnyard from the distance Cobb claims he was standing. Small mercies. Caleb said something almost like a laugh escaping him, rough and disbelieving. The Lord finally decided to hand us one. Don't thank the Lord yet, Clara said, though her eyes were bright. Thank the almanac. Corwin pulled the lunar tables from the county records office himself. Says he means to bring them right into that courtroom and lay them out plain for the judge to see. Caleb reached through the bars, and Clara took his hand, without hesitation, holding on tight enough that he could feel her pulse hammering against his palm. 2 more days, he said. 2 more days and we'll know. 2 more days, Clara agreed. And then Harold Whitaker's going to learn what it costs a man to underestimate a woman who's got nothing left to lose. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, and by 9, the small county courthouse had filled to standing room half the town crowded onto benches, meant for a fraction of their number drawn by the particular hunger small towns carried for a spectacle they could gossip about for years afterward. Caleb sat at the defense table in borrowed clothes, his wrists finally free of rope, but his stomach knotted tight enough to make breathing difficult, and Clara sat directly behind him in the front row. Emma pressed close against her side, the girl's small hand gripping a fistful of Clara's skirt, like she meant never to let go of it again. Judge Ashford was a spare, silver-haired man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and he called the proceedings to order with a single rap of his gavel that silenced the room's murmuring instantly. "State's witness," Ashford said. "Bring in Mr. Cobb." Silas Cobb shuffled to the witness chair, looking considerably less confident than the sworn statement bearing his signature had suggested he ought to be, his eyes darting toward the back of the room, where Harold Whitaker sat in a fine coat, arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that fooled no one who'd watched him operate these past weeks. The prosecutor, a thin man named Dubois, hired at Whitaker's expense, though no one said so, plain in open court, led Cobb through his statement with practiced ease. The barn, the fire, the man he claimed to have seen with a coal oil can, features clear enough to identify beyond doubt. "And you're certain," Dubois pressed, "that the man you saw was the defendant Caleb Whitmore?" "Certain as anything," Cobb said, though his voice wavered on the words. Then it was Corwin's turn, standing to cross-examine with the county's lunar tables spread open on the rail before him, his weathered face set with the particular satisfaction of a lawman who'd finally found solid ground beneath a case that had felt wrong from the very start. "Mr. Cobb," Corwin said, "you claim you saw the defendant's face clear enough to identify at a distance of, by your own statement, some 40 yards at 2 in the morning during a fire." "That's right. Fires give off considerable light, don't they?" "They surely do," Cobb agreed, a shade too eager. "Would it surprise you to learn," Corwin said, lifting the almanac for the whole courtroom to see that the moon that night was in its final quarter, barely a sliver, and that according to the weather report filed by the telegraph office that same evening, heavy cloud cover had rolled in by midnight and didn't clear till nearly dawn, meaning the only light available to you that night would have come from the fire itself and a fire. Mr. Cobb throws light forward and up, not sideways, across a distance of 40 yards to illuminate a man's face standing in shadow at the barn's edge. Cobb's confidence cracked visibly, his eyes flicking again toward the back of the courtroom. I know what I saw." "Do you?" Corwin said. "Then perhaps you can explain how you came into possession of a $10 gold piece the very night after the fire spent freely at the Golden Spur Saloon, when your own employer testified last month that you hadn't drawn full wages in over a month on account of missed work." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Cobb's face had gone pale and sweating. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I believe you do," Corwin said, and nodded toward the courtroom doors, where Otis Reyes stood waiting, hat in hand, having just been called forward by the bailiff. Reyes took the stand with visible nerves but a steady voice, and told the courtroom exactly what he'd told Clara in his saloon days, before the gold piece, the bragging, the mention of a wealthy rancher who'd needed a story told right. "Did Mr. Cobb ever say the name of this rancher directly?" Dubois demanded on cross-examination, seizing at the one gap in the testimony with obvious desperation. "No, sir," Reyes admitted. "Never said a name outright. But he did say the man owned half the east side of the county. And there ain't but one man fitting that description, with reason enough to want Caleb Whitmore blamed for a fire." The courtroom erupted into murmuring loud enough that Ashford had to bang his gavel twice to restore order, and Caleb, sitting frozen at the defense table, felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in a week. Not relief, not yet, but the first thin thread of it. Hope daring to unfurl, despite everything that had tried to strangle it these past days. Then Judge Ashford turned his sharp eyes on Silas Cobb, still sweating in the witness chair, and the question that followed changed the entire shape of the morning. "Mr. Cobb." Ashford set his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how to unravel a frightened liar. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to consider very carefully before you answer, because perjury before this court carries its own considerable penalty separate and apart from whatever penalty a false accusation of arson might carry for the man you've testified against. Did you, or did you not, actually witness Caleb Whitmore near that barn the night it burned?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that Caleb could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Cobb's composure finally broke entirely. "No." He said the word coming out as barely more than a whisper, before he found the strength to say it louder, almost as if the confession itself were a weight lifting off him. "No, I didn't see him. I was paid to say I did. $100 half up front, half after I signed the statement. Man told me exactly what to say, gave me the details to make it sound real." The courtroom exploded into noise, and Ashford's gavel came down again and again, and Caleb felt Clara's hand grip his shoulder from behind. Her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt, and he reached back and covered her hand with his own, without looking away from the witness stand. "And who," Ashford demanded once order had finally been restored, "paid you that $100, Mr. Cobb?" Cobb's eyes found Harold Whitaker at the back of the courtroom, and something in the desperate cornered look on his face told the whole room the answer before he ever spoke it aloud. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "Harold Whitaker paid me to say I saw Caleb Whitmore set that fire." The room went dead silent for one long suspended heartbeat, and then erupted entirely. Chairs, scraping voices rising. Half the courtroom twisting in their seats to stare at Whitaker, who had gone the color of old ash, his composure finally completely shattered. "That's a lie." Whitaker was on his feet, his voice cracking with a panic. None of them had ever heard from him before. "That drifter's saying whatever he thinks will save his own neck." "Your Honor, you can't possibly." "Sit down, Mr. Whitaker," Ashford said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Or I'll have the bailiff remove you from this courtroom." Whitaker sat, but his hands were shaking now, and Caleb watched the last of that carefully constructed confidence crumble away from him piece by piece, exposing something smaller and more frightened underneath a man who'd spent 5 years building an elaborate scheme on the assumption that money and patience could buy him anything he wanted. Watching that same scheme collapse in the space of 10 devastating minutes. Corwin wasn't finished. He rose again, drawing a folded document from his coat with the deliberate care of a man who'd been saving his best evidence for exactly this moment. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to enter into evidence a survey map recovered near the boundary of Mrs. Bennett's property dated 3 months prior to the events in question, bearing a notation in Mr. Whitaker's own hand, authorizing additional compensation to the surveyor evidence. I believe that establishes a clear and long-standing motive for the pattern of sabotage, false accusation, and arson that has plagued Blackwood Ranch these past several weeks." Dubois was on his feet objecting, but Ashford waved him down, already reaching for the map. Corwin extended his sharp eyes, tracing the damning notation, with an expression that told the whole courtroom exactly how the morning was about to end. "This court," Ashford said, finally setting the map down, with the particular finality of a judge who'd made up his mind entirely, finds insufficient credible evidence to sustain the charges against Caleb Whitmore, and orders those charges dismissed immediately. Furthermore, given the testimony and evidence presented this morning, I am ordering the sheriff's office to open a full investigation into Harold Whitaker's conduct, including but not limited to charges of witness tampering, perjury by proxy, and arson. The gavel came down one final time, and the courtroom erupted into a roar of noise that Caleb barely heard over the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears, because Clara was already climbing over the low rail separating the gallery from the defense table, and Emma was right behind her, and then they were both in his arms at once, Emma sobbing into his chest, and Clara's face pressed against his shoulder. Her own tears finally falling after a week of holding herself together through sheer stubborn will. "I told you," Clara said, her voice muffled and thick. "I told you I'd fix this Caleb Whitmore." "You did?" Caleb managed, holding his daughter and the woman who'd fought harder for his freedom than anyone in his life ever had, both of them together, and felt something break open in his chest that had nothing to do with grief. "You surely did." Across the courtroom, 2 deputies had already moved to flank Harold Whitaker, who sat frozen in his seat, his face gone slack with the particular shock of a man watching everything he'd built collapse in real time. He looked up once briefly, and his eyes found Clara's across the crowded room, and whatever he saw in her expression, steady, unflinching, utterly without mercy, seemed to finally convince him that whatever fight he had left in him wasn't worth the spending. "This isn't over," he said, but the words came out weak, more habit than conviction, the last gasp of a man who already knew he'd lost. "It surely is Harold," Clara said, loud enough for half the courtroom to hear. "It's been over since the moment you decided burning an innocent man's freedom was worth more to you than a fair fight." The deputies led him out through the side door, and the crowd parted to let him pass, and Caleb watched the faces of the very same townsfolk who'd whispered and pulled their children close and looked at him with suspicion. These past weeks, now watching Whitaker's departure, with expressions ranging from shock to something that looked almost like shame. Mrs. Pemberton, of all people, was the first to approach as the courtroom began to empty. Her face flushed with an emotion Caleb couldn't quite name, not quite apology, but something adjacent to it, the discomfort of a woman confronting the cost of her own quick judgments. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, twisting her gloved hands together, "I owe you an apology, I expect. I said things about you and Mrs. Bennet that weren't fair, weren't kind, and weren't true. I hope you'll accept my regret for it." Caleb studied her a moment, weighing the words, and found to his own surprise that he didn't have the energy left in him for bitterness. "Apology accepted, Mrs. Pemberton," he said. "Folks say foolish things when they're frightened of what they don't understand. I reckon most of us have been guilty of that one time or another." Pemberton nodded, something like gratitude crossing her sharp features, and moved off through the thinning crowd, and Clara, still standing pressed close against Caleb's side, with Emma held tight between them, let out a long breath that seemed to carry the whole weight of the past month with it. "It's really over," she said, disbelief still coloring her voice, as if she hadn't quite allowed herself to believe it even now, standing in the aftermath. "The trial's over," Caleb said carefully. "I expect there's more work yet. Corwin's investigation, whatever charges finally stick against Whitaker, sorting through the wreckage he left behind. But yes, the worst of it's over." They rode back to the ranch together that afternoon. The 3 of them crowded onto the wagon seat with Emma wedged happily between them, chattering with the boundless relief of a child whose world had righted itself after weeks of quiet, unspoken fear. And Caleb found himself watching Clara more than the road ahead, watching the way the afternoon sun caught the gray in her hair, and the fierce, exhausted joy still lingering in her expression. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, once Emma had finally worn herself out talking and drifted into a doze against Clara's shoulder. "Now we rebuild the barn," Clara said. "Now we get the ranch back in order before winter sets in proper. Now Corwin builds whatever case he needs against Whitaker, and we let the law finish what we started this morning." "That's not what I meant," Caleb said. Clara glanced over at him, something careful and searching in her pale gray eyes. "What did you mean then?" Caleb hesitated, the words he'd been carrying unspoken for weeks now, suddenly feeling both too large and too fragile to trust to open air. "I meant us, Clara. I meant what happens between us now after everything. I know I came to your gate a stranger with nothing to offer but a sick child and empty hands. But somewhere along the way, working your land and fighting your fights and watching you fight mine right back, I stopped thinking of you as my employer. I don't rightly know what to call what I feel instead. But I know it's there, and I know I'm not willing to pretend otherwise any longer." Clara was quiet a long moment, the wagon wheels creaking beneath them. Emma's soft breathing, the only other sound on the empty road. "I've been telling myself for weeks it was foolish," she admitted finally, her voice low and unguarded, in a way Caleb had rarely heard from her. A widow my age, my size, entertaining notions about a hired hand, half her worries and twice her trouble. I buried a husband once already, Caleb. I buried a daughter. I told myself after that I hadn't the strength left to risk loving something else that might get taken from me. And now?" Caleb asked, his heart hammering harder than it had even standing before Judge Ashford that morning. "Now, I think I've spent 3 years confusing caution for wisdom," Clara said. "And I think a man who ran into a burning barn to save my horses and never once wavered standing accused of a crime he didn't commit, and looked at a little girl who wasn't his blood and loved her anyway. I think that's not the kind of man a woman ought to be careful around. I think that's exactly the kind of man worth being brave for." Caleb reached over, careful not to jostle Emma, still sleeping between them, and took Clara's hand, and this time neither one of them let go for the rest of the ride home. They hadn't been home more than an hour. The wagon horses barely unhitched when a rider came up the drive at a hard canter, and Caleb's stomach clenched from old habit before he recognized Corwin's familiar shape in the saddle. "Didn't mean to intrude on your first evening of peace," Corwin said, swinging down his weathered face, carrying an expression somewhere between grim satisfaction and genuine relief. "But I figured you'd want to know straight away. We rode out to Whitaker's spread not 2 hours after that gavel came down, search warrant in hand, courtesy of Judge Ashford's considerable displeasure. Found your breeding stock. Mrs. Bennet penned in a back pasture with fresh brands laid clumsy over your own markings. Found the coal oil cans, 2 still smelling of the same accelerant used on your barn tucked in behind his tack shed, like he never once imagined anybody would think to look." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "You're certain my breeding stock truly, certain as I've ever been about anything in 30 years wearing this badge," Corwin said. "All 12 head thin and mistreated, but alive every one of them. I've got men driving them back this way come morning." Caleb felt something enormous loosen in his chest relief, piling on top of relief, until it nearly buckled his knees. "And Whitaker, sitting in the very cell you just vacated, Mr. Whitmore." Corwin said something grim and satisfied in his voice now. "Charged with cattle theft, arson, witness tampering, and enough besides that I doubt even his money's going to buy him clear of all of it this time. Man's lawyer from the county seat already rode out to see him, took one look at the evidence we're building, and I heard tell he advised his client to start thinking hard about a plea, rather than risking a full trial in front of a jury that's heard every word of what came out in that courtroom this morning." "He'll hang," Clara said quietly, not quite a question. "Arson's a hanging offense, like I told you," Corwin said. "Whether it comes to that, or whether his lawyer manages to talk the charge down to something short of the rope, I couldn't say for certain. But I can tell you this much. Mrs. Bennet Harold Whitaker's never going to trouble you, or anyone else in this county again one way or the other. That much I promise you plain." He tipped his hat and mounted back up, refusing Clara's offer of supper with a tired smile, explaining he had a long night of paperwork ahead of him yet, and rode off down the darkening drive, leaving the 3 of them standing together in a silence that felt for the first time, in longer than Caleb could remember, entirely free of dread. Word of what had happened in that courtroom spread through the county faster than any gossip Whitaker himself had ever managed to plant. And by Saturday morning, Caleb woke to the sound of wagons rolling up the long drive. Not deputies, not trouble, but neighbors. A dozen families arriving with lumber and tools and baskets of food, come to raise Clara a new barn before the fall weather turned. Caleb stood on the porch steps, stunned into silence, watching men he'd never spoken 2 words to before that week, climbing down from their wagons with saws and hammers in hand, and it was Mrs. Pemberton, of all people, who climbed down from the lead wagon, carrying a basket of fresh bread, Her chin lifted with the particular determination of a woman making amends the only way her pride would allow. "We heard what that man tried to do," she said, setting the basket in Clara's arms before either of them could find words. "Whitaker fooled half this town with his lies, Mrs. Bennet, myself included, and I expect we owe you and Mr. Whitmore both a good deal more than an apology can cover. This is the least any of us can offer." Clara stood holding the breadbasket, her throat working, unable for a long moment to find her voice at all. "Thank you," she managed finally. I hardly know what to say." "Don't say anything." One of the ranch hands from a neighboring spread called out cheerfully, already hauling lumber toward the burned foundation. "Just point us where you want the walls to go, ma'am, and we'll have you a barn by sundown." By noon, the frame was already rising, men calling instructions back and forth, children chasing each other through the sawdust, while their mothers spread quilts across the grass and laid out enough food to feed twice the gathered crowd. Emma darted between the legs of working men with a joy Caleb hadn't seen in her since before Mary's death. And when he caught Clara's eye across the busy yard, watching her own ranch fill with the sound of neighbors' laughter, for the first time in years, he saw tears standing bright and unashamed in her pale gray eyes. 5 years, she said quietly when he came to stand beside her. 5 years I told myself I didn't need this town. Didn't need any of them on account of how they treated me after Thomas died. And now look. People make mistakes when they're frightened or lazy or listening to the wrong voice too long, Caleb said. Doesn't excuse it, but it doesn't mean it can't be mended either. Clara leaned into him just slightly, watching her new barn rise plank by plank under a dozen willing hands, and said nothing more because nothing more needed saying. By the time the sun began sinking toward the western ridge, the barn stood framed and half-roofed, a solid promise of shelter before winter's first snow, and the gathered families packed up their wagons with the easy, satisfied exhaustion of people who'd spent a good day's labor on something worth building. Clara stood at the gate, seeing off the last of them, shaking hands, accepting embraces from women who'd whispered against her, not 3 weeks before, and Caleb watched the whole transformation with something warm and steady, settling deep into his chest, the particular hard-won satisfaction of watching wrong slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely made right. That evening, with the household worn out from a day of honest labor and good company, Sarah wept openly while ladling out a celebratory supper twice the usual size, and even the ranch hands' gruff men who'd said little through the whole ordeal came by the kitchen door one by one to shake Caleb's hand and mutter their own rough congratulations. Emma, freshly bathed and glowing with the particular happiness of a child who finally understood, in whatever simple terms a 5-year-old could hold, that the frightening thing was truly over, climbed into Caleb's lap at the supper table and pressed the mended rag doll into his hands. "I finished Bess's sleeve," she announced proudly. "See little stitches, just like Miss Clara showed me." Caleb examined the careful, uneven stitching with the solemnity the moment deserved. "That's fine work, sweetheart. Your mama would be awful proud." "Miss Clara says I've got a gift for it," Emma said, then paused, her small face going thoughtful in the particular way children's faces did when working through something too large for easy words. "Papa, is Mr. Whitaker going away forever?" Caleb exchanged a glance with Clara across the table before answering carefully. "He's going away for a long while, yes. He did some very wrong things, and now he has to answer for them." "Good," Emma said, with the simple, uncomplicated fierceness of a child who'd watched her father dragged away in ropes and hadn't forgotten it. "He was mean. Mean people should have to answer for it." "That they should," Clara agreed softly, reaching over to smooth the girl's hair, and something in the easy, natural way she did it, the gesture of a woman who no longer thought twice about offering comfort to a child, not born of her own body, made Caleb's throat tighten with an emotion too large to name at the supper table. "Papa," Emma said around a yawn she was fighting valiantly to hold back, "does this mean we get to stay here forever now, at the ranch?" Caleb looked to Clara before answering some silent question passing between the two adults that Emma was too sleepy to catch. "That's not entirely up to me alone anymore, sweetheart," he said carefully. But I expect the answer's going to be yes. I expect it's going to be yes for a good long while." Emma smiled satisfied and let her head droop against his shoulder, and Sarah came to carry the half-asleep girl off to bed, with the practiced ease of a woman who'd done it 100 times before leaving Caleb and Clara alone at the table, amid the wreckage of a celebration well-earned. Later, with Emma finally tucked into bed after a supper eaten twice over, out of pure celebratory appetite, Caleb and Clara sat together on the porch steps where they'd first spoken honestly to each other weeks before, watching the sun go down. Gold and gentle over the western ridge, the new barn frame standing dark and solid against the fading sky like a promise already half kept. "There's still work ahead," Clara said, breaking a comfortable silence that had stretched between them for several long, easy minutes. "Corwin's investigation, whatever trial comes of it, rebuilding what Whitaker tried to burn down in more ways than the barn alone." "I know it," Caleb said, "but we'll do it together. Same as we've done everything else since that first night." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, an easy, natural gesture that felt like it had always belonged between them, even though it was entirely new, and Caleb wrapped his arm around her, feeling the whole weight of the past terrible weeks finally truly begin to lift. "You know," Clara said softly, "when you first came pounding on my gate half out of your mind, with fear for that girl, I thought the Lord was giving me a strange, undeserved second chance. I didn't know then just how much of a chance it would turn out to be." "Neither did I," Caleb admitted. "I came looking for work and a safe place to raise my daughter. I never once expected to find—" He paused, searching for the right word, and found when he finally spoke it that it fit better than any word had fit anything in a long, long time. "Home. I never expected to find home." Clara looked up at him, then her pale gray eyes soft in the fading light, and something passed between them that no longer needed careful words to name it. "There was a moment," she admitted, "back before you ever came knocking, when I'd nearly convinced myself this ranch would be the whole of my life, from here on, the cattle, the work, the empty rooms upstairs. I stopped going into because they held too much of what I'd lost. I'd made my peace with that, or told myself I had. It's a strange thing having a peace like that shaken loose by a stranger pounding on your gate in the rain." "Strange," Caleb agreed, "and I expect the finest thing that's happened to either one of us in a long while, whatever fear came riding in alongside it." "Whatever fear came riding in alongside it," Clara repeated softly, and Caleb felt her hand find his in the gathering dark, her fingers lacing through his own, with the easy certainty of something that had always belonged there, waiting only for the courage to claim it. Out past the ridge, the last color drained slow and easy from the sky, and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a place finally truly at peace. After weeks of storm, a quiet that carried none of the held-breath dread of the nights before. But something else entirely. Something that felt for the first time in longer than either of them cared to admit remarkably close to happiness. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Caleb nor Clara had dared hope for through all the weeks of fire and false accusation. Ordinary days, blessedly ordinary, filled with the small, unremarkable business of running a ranch, instead of fighting for their lives against it. The new barn rose complete within a fortnight, its timbers still pale and raw against the older weathered buildings around it, and the breeding stock. Corwin's men had recovered from Whitaker's land, grazed fat and healthy again in the north pasture, their stolen months already fading from memory beneath good grass and steady care. Word came from the county seat 3 weeks after the hearing that Harold Whitaker had on his lawyer's counsel entered a plea, rather than risk the full weight of a jury trial. Guilty to arson, guilty to witness tampering, guilty to cattle theft. The charge of attempted murder connected to the barn fire, reduced in exchange for his cooperation in surrendering what remained of his ill-gotten assets. Judge Ashford sentenced him to 15 years at the territorial prison, a sentence that fell short of the rope but left no doubt in anyone's mind, least of all Whitaker's own, that his 5-year campaign to steal Blackwood Ranch had cost him considerably more than the pasture he'd coveted. 15 years, Clara said, reading the news from the county paper Corwin had ridden out personally to deliver, her voice carrying no triumph, only a weary, hard-won relief. "That's near a lifetime for a man his age." He'll come out an old man if he comes out at all." "Does it satisfy you?" Caleb asked, watching her fold the paper closed with careful hands. Clara considered the question a long moment. "I don't know that satisfaction's the right word for it. I think I'm just glad it's finished. Glad Emma won't grow up looking over her shoulder, wondering if the man who tried to burn her father alive is still riding free somewhere close enough to trouble us again." "That's satisfaction enough for me, too," Caleb said, and meant it. And the railroad, when its route was finally announced publicly that autumn ran precisely where Grant's stolen map had shown, it would cutting clean through the eastern edge of Blackwood Ranch, and within a month, the value of Clara's land had climbed high enough that offers began arriving from legitimate buyers and railroad agents alike, offers considerably more honest than Whitaker's, and considerably easier to refuse. "I'm not selling," Clara told each one plainly, standing at her own gate the way she'd stood there 5 years running against every man who doubted her. "Not the east pasture, not any acre of this land. But I'll talk terms on a right-of-way lease if the railroad's willing to pay fair for the privilege of crossing my ground." By the time the first frost came, Clara Bennett had negotiated a lease that would set Blackwood Ranch on considerably steadier financial footing than it had known even in its best years before Thomas's death. Money enough to hire on 2 more hands to expand the herd to finally repair the sections of fence line that had gone patched and neglected through years of doing everything alone. "Funny thing," she told Caleb one evening going over the lease figures at the kitchen table by lamplight. Emma long since asleep upstairs in the room that had, without anyone ever formally deciding it, become simply hers. "Harold spent 5 years trying to steal this land out from under me because he knew what it would be worth. And here I am now, richer for that railroad than he ever managed to become trying to cheat his way to it." "Poetic justice," Caleb said. "The Lord's got a particular sense of humor about these things, seems like." "Seems like," Clara agreed, and reached across the table to lace her fingers through his, an easy, unremarkable gesture, now worn smooth by weeks of quiet repetition. The kind of small intimacy that had grown between them, not through grand declaration, but through the slow accumulation of 100 ordinary evenings, just like this one. It was on one such evening, 3 weeks into the new year, that Caleb finally worked up the nerve to say the thing he'd been carrying carefully folded close to his chest since that first honest conversation on the wagon ride home from the courthouse. But the path to that evening hadn't come without its own small trials. A week before Emma had come home from the schoolhouse with her chin held high and her knuckles skinned raw, refusing at first to explain either. "Emma Whitmore," Clara had said, kneeling to examine the girl's scraped hand with the same careful competence she'd once brought to nursing Emma's fever. "What happened at school today?" "Nothing," Emma said, though her jaw was set in a way that told both adults plainly there was considerably more to the story. "Emma," Caleb pressed gently. The girl's composure finally cracked. "Billy Sutter said Papa was a horse thief, and you weren't really my mama. Just some old widow trying to steal a family that wasn't yours to steal. So I hit him." Clara's breath caught something fierce and pained crossing her face before she carefully smoothed it away. "You can't go round hitting folks, sweetheart," Caleb said, though he found it considerably harder than it should have been to summon real disapproval in his voice. "He was wrong," Emma said stubbornly. "You're not a horse thief, and Mama Clara's not stealing anything. She's just my mama. My other mama's in heaven, and Mama Clara's here, and that's not stealing, that's just love, and Billy Sutter doesn't know anything about anything." Clara pulled the girl into a tight embrace, her own eyes bright. "You're right, Emma, every word of it. But next time, use your words before your fists, hard as that might be. Words carry a good deal more power than folks give them credit for, and they don't leave your knuckles skinned raw besides." "Yes, ma'am," Emma said, though the fierce satisfaction in her voice suggested the lesson hadn't fully taken root just yet, and Caleb, watching his daughter defend her family with the same stubborn courage Clara herself had shown against Whitaker's lies, felt something in his chest swell with a pride too large for easy words. It was that same fierce, unshakable devotion witnessed afresh in his own daughter that had finally given Caleb the courage he'd needed to stop carrying his own unspoken feelings, folded quiet and careful, and to say plainly what his whole family already seemed to understand without him ever having voiced it aloud. He'd planned it out beforehand, the way he'd have planned any careful considered piece of work, waited until Emma had gone down for the night, waited for one of the quiet, easy evenings they'd grown accustomed to sharing on the porch steps, waited until the words had stopped feeling too large to fit through his mouth. But when the moment actually arrived, all his careful planning fell away entirely, and what came out instead was simply the truth, plain and unadorned as everything else that had passed honestly between them since that first terrible night at her gate. "Clara," he said, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him, fully setting aside the mending she'd had balanced on her knee. "I've been turning something over in my mind a good long while now, and I find I can't turn it over silent any longer." "Well," she said, something careful and hopeful flickering behind her pale gray eyes. "Out with it then, Caleb Whitmore. You've never been a man to dance around plain truth before. Marry me." Caleb said the words coming out rougher and less polished than he'd intended, but no less true for the roughness. "I know I came to your gate with nothing but a sick child and a broken heart. I know I've got no land of my own to offer, no fine house, nothing but 2 hands and whatever wages you've been paying me these past months. But I love you, Clara Bennett. I love the way you fight for what's yours, and the way you fought for me when I had nothing left to fight with myself. I love watching you with Emma, and I love the way this ranch has come to feel like home in a way I never once believed I'd find again after Mary died. I'm not offering you much, but I'm offering you everything I've got left to give, and I'm asking you plain and simple to be my wife." Clara sat very still for a long moment, her hands stilled entirely over the mending in her lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out thick with an emotion she made no effort to disguise. "You fool, man," she said, and Caleb's heart dropped clean through the porch boards until she continued, tears standing bright in her eyes, even as a smile broke wide and unguarded across her weathered face. "You fool, wonderful man. Do you think I've been sitting here these past months just for the pleasure of your fence mending? I've loved you since the night you carried that dying child through my gate and wept on my kitchen floor like your whole world had already ended. I just didn't have the courage to say it first. Is that a yes?" Caleb asked, hardly daring to believe it even as she said it. "That's the surest yes I've ever given anything in my whole stubborn life," Clara said. And then his arms were around her and hers around him, and the porch that had witnessed so much fear and grief and quiet honest talk between them these past months witnessed something else entirely. Now the particular unguarded joy of 2 people who had each buried enough loss to last a lifetime, finding against every hard lesson either of them had learned that love could still find its way back into a heart that had thought itself closed for good. They told Emma the next morning, both of them together, sitting her down at the kitchen table, with the same careful gravity Caleb had once used to explain his arrest, though this news carried an entirely different weight. "Emma, sweetheart," Caleb began, "Clara and I have got something important to tell you. You're getting married," Emma said before either of them could continue. Her small face lit with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated delight that both adults froze in surprise. "I already knew. Everybody knew, Papa. Sarah's been saying it for weeks." Caleb laughed despite himself, some of the careful tension in his shoulders dissolving at his daughter's blunt, unimpressed pronouncement. "Is that so?" "That's so," Emma confirmed with the solemn authority of a 5-year-old who considered herself considerably wiser than the adults around her gave her credit for. "Does this mean Miss Clara's going to be my new mama?" The question landed heavier than Emma likely intended, and Caleb watched Clara's face, carefully uncertain how she'd handle the enormity folded inside such a simple child's question. Clara knelt down slowly until she was eye level with the girl, taking both of Emma's small hands in her own weathered ones. "I'll never try to replace your mama," Clara said, her voice careful and gentle, in a way that told Caleb she'd thought this answer through long before the question ever arrived. "Your mama loved you first, and loved you fierce, and taught you to sew little stitches, and I'd never presume to take her place in your heart. But I love you too, Emma Whitmore, same as if you'd been born to me instead of just walked through my gate half sick and half starved that terrible night. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to be your family in whatever way fits best. Mama Clara, if that suits you. Or just Clara, if that suits you better. Either way, you're stuck with me now for keeps." Emma considered this with the same fierce seriousness she brought to every important decision, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Mama Clara," she decided, finally testing the shape of the words. "I like that. It's got room in it for both my mamas." Something broke open in Clara's face, then wet and radiant all at once, and she pulled Emma into an embrace that the girl returned with her whole small body. And Caleb, watching the two people who'd become the whole of his world, holding on to each other in his own kitchen, felt his own eyes go hot and blurred with a happiness too enormous to hold quietly. The wedding took place in early spring, when the last of the winter frost had finally released its grip on the Montana hills, and the first green shoots were pushing up bright through last year's dead grass, and the whole county turned out for it. The same neighbors who'd raised the barn, now filling Clara's yard with wagons and wildflowers, and enough food to feed twice their number. The same Mrs. Pemberton, who'd once whispered poison in the mercantile, now weeping openly into a handkerchief in the front row. The same ranch hands who'd said little through the darkest weeks, now standing witness with their hats pressed to their chests. Sheriff Corwin himself stood as Caleb's best man, a role he accepted with the same gruff, unpolished sincerity he brought to everything else in his life. "Never thought I'd stand up for a man I once had to arrest," Corwin said, adjusting Caleb's borrowed collar, with hands more accustomed to handling a badge than a bow tie. "But I don't reckon I've ever been prouder to be wrong about anything in my whole career wearing this star." "You were never wrong about me, Sheriff," Caleb said. "You just had a job to do, same as I had a fight to win. I don't hold it against you. Never did." "Good man," Corwin said, clapping him once on the shoulder. "Good man, and about to become a considerably luckier one, if you don't mind my saying so." Emma served as flower girl, scattering wildflower petals down the makeshift aisle between the assembled wagons with a solemn concentration that made half the gathered crowd laugh with delight. And when Clara finally appeared walking out from the house in a simple dress of deep blue that Sarah had helped her sew over the preceding weeks, Caleb found he had no words left in him at all, only the particular overwhelming certainty that he was watching the single finest thing that had ever happened to him. Walking toward him across an ordinary ranch yard, transformed for one afternoon into something sacred. The preacher, a circuit rider who covered 4 counties and had married half the couples in the territory over the past decade, spoke the familiar words with unhurried warmth, and when he asked if anyone present objected to the union, the only sound that answered him was Emma's small, clear voice calling out from the front row. "Nobody objects, everybody's real happy about it." Laughter rippled through the crowd, warm and easy, and even the preacher had to pause a moment to compose himself before continuing. And Caleb, looking down at his daughter's beaming face, and then up at Clara's own bright laughing eyes, thought that he had never in his whole hard wandering life felt so thoroughly, completely surrounded by love. "Do you, Caleb Whitmore, take this woman?" "I do," Caleb said, before the preacher had even finished the question, drawing another ripple of laughter from the gathered crowd, and Clara's answering smile wide and unguarded, and utterly without the careful reserve she'd worn like armor through 5 long years of standing alone against a world that hadn't always been kind to her. "Do you, Clara Bennett, take this man?" "I do," Clara said, just as swift, just as certain, and when the preacher finally pronounced them married and gave Caleb leave to kiss his bride. The yard erupted into a cheer, loud enough to send the barn cats scattering, and Sarah's chickens, into an indignant squawking flurry across the yard, and Caleb kissed his wife in front of the whole assembled county with a joy so complete it felt for one suspended perfect moment, like every hard year of loss and walking and desperate hope had been leading exactly here, to this ordinary ranch yard, filled with wildflowers and neighbors, and the particular unrepeatable happiness of 2 broken people finding themselves whole again in each other. The celebration ran long into the evening, fiddle music and dancing, and enough food to feed the whole county twice over. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a letter arrived by way of the evening stage, forwarded from the territorial prison, and addressed in a cramped, unfamiliar hand to Mrs. Clara Whitmore. Corwin, who'd stayed on past the ceremony to enjoy the festivities, recognized the return address before Clara had even broken the seal, and his face went carefully neutral in the way of a lawman bracing for trouble even on a day meant for joy. "You don't have to read that today," he said quietly. "Whatever it is, it can wait." "No," Clara said, turning the envelope over once in her hands. "I'd rather know now on a day I'm strong enough to bear whatever's in it than let it sit unopened, stealing peace from some ordinary evening later on." She broke the seal and read in silence, her expression unreadable, while Caleb waited beside her with his heart in his throat, uncertain what fresh trouble Harold Whitaker might still find a way to cause even from behind prison walls. But when Clara finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes that carried none of the old fear, only something that looked astonishingly like a kind of hard-won peace. "He's asking forgiveness," she said, disbelief plain in her voice. "Says prison's given him considerable time to think on what greed cost him, and what it nearly cost the rest of us. Says he doesn't expect me to grant it, but he felt he owed the asking." "Do you believe him?" Caleb asked carefully. "I believe a man locked away 15 years has ample cause to reconsider his sins," Clara said. "Whether that reconsidering is sincere or just convenient, I couldn't say for certain, and I'm not sure it much matters either way." She folded the letter closed, something settling and final in the gesture. "I don't forgive him for his sake, Caleb. I forgive him for mine, so I'm not carrying his poison around in my own heart on the happiest day I've had in years. That's the only kind of forgiveness that ever does a body any real good." She tucked the letter away and turned back to the celebration with a lightness that told Caleb she meant every word of it, and he found himself, not for the first time since that desperate rainy night at her gate, in awe of the particular strength his wife carried so plainly and so quietly beneath everything else she was. They rejoined the festivities, and somewhere in the middle of the dancing, Caleb found himself standing beside Clara. His wife, he thought, testing the word in his mind, and finding it fit better than any word had ever fit anything, watching Emma spin in dizzy circles with a gaggle of other ranch children, her laughter carrying clear and bright across the darkening yard. "You know," Clara said, leaning into his side, "when you first came through that gate, I thought I was offering you charity, taking in a desperate stranger out of Christian obligation, nothing more." "And now," Caleb asked. "Now I understand you were the one offering me something," Clara said. "I'd built such careful walls around myself after Thomas and Rose Caleb. Told myself I didn't need anybody, that this ranch and this work were enough to fill a life on their own. I'd nearly convinced myself of it too, right up until a stranger came pounding on my gate in the rain and reminded me what it felt like to have a family filling up all those empty rooms again. We built this together," Caleb said. "Every bit of it. The fight against Whitaker, this wedding, whatever comes next. I don't rightly know how to thank you for taking a chance on 2 lost souls that terrible night." "Don't thank me," Clara said, echoing words she'd spoken to him once before in a different season, under a different weight of fear. "Just keep passing the kindness on, same as I told you the very first week you came here. That's the only repayment that ever mattered to me." Summer came full and generous that year, the ranch thriving under 2 capable hands, working as true partners rather than employer and employee, the herd growing fat on good grass, the railroad money paying for improvements that would carry Blackwood Ranch steady through whatever winters lay ahead. Emma grew tall and brown from long days outdoors, splitting her time between her lessons at the schoolhouse and long afternoons trailing after Clara through the barn and the hen house, absorbing the particular knowledge of ranch life, the same way she'd once absorbed her mother's careful stitches with a fierce, devoted attention that promised someday to make her every bit as capable a woman as the 2 who'd raised her. It was in late August, nearly a year to the day since that first desperate night at the gate, that Clara came to Caleb with news that changed the shape of their small, hard-won family once more. "I'm carrying," she told him, standing in the kitchen with her hands pressed flat against her apron, her voice carrying a mixture of joy and disbelief that Caleb recognized because he felt the exact same tangled knot of feeling rising in his own chest. "Doc Hensley confirmed it this morning. Come spring, God willing, there'll be another child in this house." Caleb crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and lifted her clean off her feet, spinning her once before setting her down with the sudden, careful gentleness of a man remembering all at once exactly how precious the news he'd just received truly was. Clara. Her name came out of him thick with emotion. He made no effort to disguise. Clara, that's after everything. After all you told me about Rose, are you certain you're— I'm certain I'm terrified, Clara admitted, laughing and crying at once. And I'm certain I'm happier than I've been in more years than I can rightly count. I lost a child once, Caleb. I know the fear of that loss better than most anyone ought to have to know it. But I've also learned this past year that love worth having is always going to carry some fear alongside it. I'm not willing to let that fear stop me from welcoming this baby the same way I welcomed you and Emma both with my whole heart. Whatever risk comes bundled up inside it. Emma told the news that evening with the same careful ceremony that had once informed her of the wedding, received it with an enthusiasm that surprised neither of her parents in the slightest. A baby, she announced, practically vibrating with excitement. Is it going to be a sister? I want a sister. Tommy's got 3 brothers already, and he says they're an awful lot of trouble. We'll love whoever the Lord sends us, Clara said, pulling the girl into a warm embrace. Brother or sister, both same as we loved you the moment you walked through that gate sick and scared and half-starved, and turned this whole house upside down with love we didn't even know we were missing. The winter that followed brought its own trials the way every Montana winter did, and in late January, with Clara's belly grown round and heavy beneath her heaviest wool coat, a blizzard rolled down off the mountains, hard enough to strand 3 head of cattle in a drift near the north fence line. And Caleb found himself out in weather no sensible man would have chosen, digging frantically at packed snow, with Clara's voice still ringing in his ears from that morning's argument. You'll not go out in that alone, she told him, standing in the kitchen doorway with her hands braced on her hips despite the considerable belly between them. Not with a storm blowing in fresh off the mountains, and me 8 months gone and needing you in one piece, Caleb Whitmore. Those cattle die outs there. We lose a season's profit and half our breeding stock besides, Caleb had argued. I'll take Thomas with me. I'll rope in if the wind picks up bad. I'll be careful. But I can't sit inside and watch good animals freeze when I've got the strength to save them. Clara had relented, though not without extracting a promise that he'd turn back the moment the weather worsened past reason, and Caleb had ridden out with one of the newer hands into a whiteout that tested every ounce of that promise's sincerity. They found the stranded cattle half buried and near frozen, worked 2 brutal hours breaking them free and driving them toward shelter. And Caleb came home after dark, with frost burning his face and hands numb, clean through his gloves, to find Clara waiting on the porch, despite the cold refusing to come inside until she'd seen him safe with her own eyes. Never again, she said, half furious and half weeping with relief as she hauled him bodily through the door toward the fire. Never again do you frighten me like that. Do you hear me not, with a baby coming and a family that needs you whole? I hear you, Caleb said through chattering teeth, and meant it fully, chastened in a way no amount of arguing beforehand had managed to accomplish. I hear you, Clara. I'm sorry. You'd best be, she said, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders, with hands that shook nearly as badly as his own, because I've buried one husband already, and I'll not bury a second one over a handful of stubborn cattle, no matter how much profit they're worth. The scare passed, as scares in a working ranch life so often did, folded eventually into the larger rhythm of a hard winter survived together. And by the time the first thaw came threatening only the ordinary business of mud and mending fence, rather than frozen cattle and frightened wives, Caleb had learned a lesson about caution that no amount of Clara's earlier stubbornness could have taught him alone. Spring arrived slow and reluctant that year, the way Montana springs so often did, but arrive it finally did, and with it came the day Clara had waited 9 long months to reach. Her labor began on a Tuesday morning, sharp and sudden, in a way that sent Sarah running for Doc Hensley before Caleb had even fully understood what was happening. And the hours that followed stretched long and terrifying, in a way that reminded Caleb, despite himself, of every dark thing Clara had once confided about losing Rose to a fever, with no one beside her to help. She'll be all right, Sarah told him firmly, more than once catching the fear plain on his face as he paced the kitchen, unable to sit still. Doc Hensley's delivered near every baby in this county the past 20 years, Mr. Whitmore. Your wife's strong as any woman I've ever known. You just trust that strength, same as she's always trusted yours." Emma sat beside him through the worst of the waiting, her small hand tucked into his own. Larger one, her face solemn, with an understanding beyond her years. "Mama Clara's going to be fine," she said, with the same fierce certainty she'd once used to insist her father would come home from jail. "She's the strongest person I know, Papa. Stronger than Whitaker, stronger than the fire, stronger than anything." "She surely is," Caleb agreed and found some measure of his own courage in his daughter's unwavering faith. The hours stretched past noon and into evening, and somewhere in the late afternoon, Doc Hensley emerged from the bedroom with a grave expression that stopped Caleb's heart cold in his chest. "Baby's turned wrong," Hensley said, wiping his hands on a cloth already stained. "I need to try and turn it before she pushes much further, and I won't lie to you, Mr. Whitmore, it's a delicate business. I need you calm, and I need you praying, and I need you trusting me to do everything in my power for both your wife and your child." "Can I see her?" Caleb asked, his voice cracking on the words. "Not yet," Hensley said, not unkindly. "Give me a half hour. I'll come for you the moment there's anything to tell." The half hour that followed was the longest of Caleb's life. Longer even than the week he'd spent behind bars awaiting trial. And he paced the kitchen floor with Emma's hand gripped tight in his own. Both of them, silent now, the earlier bravado of childhood faith giving way to the same raw, wordless fear that gripped every soul in that house. Then finally, a sound came through the bedroom door that broke the terrible silence, wide open. A thin, furious wail, unmistakably new to the world. And Caleb was on his feet and through the door before Sarah could even finish calling his name. Clara lay exhausted against the pillows, her face pale and damp with effort, but her eyes bright with a joy that outshone every ounce of the fear that had come before it, and cradled against her chest, red-faced and squalling with the particular fury of a newborn who'd fought hard for her first breath, lay their daughter. "She turned just in time," Hensley said, wiping his own brow with visible relief. "Both of them strong as anything, Mr. Whitmore. You've got yourself a healthy baby girl." Caleb crossed the room, on legs gone weak with relief, and knelt beside the bed, and Clara looked up at him with tears streaming freely down her exhausted face. "She's here," Clara whispered. "Caleb, she's here and she's whole, and she's ours." A daughter, they named her Rose, after the little girl Clara had lost and never stopped loving. And Caleb held his newest child in the same worn rocking chair where he'd once sat vigil over Emma's fever, and felt the whole enormous, unlikely circle of his life close complete around him. A man who'd arrived at a stranger's gate with nothing left to lose. Now sitting rich beyond anything money could measure, surrounded by a wife who'd fought harder for his freedom than he'd ever fought for anything himself. A daughter who'd taught him that hope could survive even the hardest roads. And now a second daughter carrying forward the name of a little girl gone too soon, wrapped safe and warm in a family built, not from blood alone, but from choice, from courage, and from the particular unrepeatable grace of two broken people who'd looked at each other across a desperate rainy night and decided against every hard lesson the world had taught them to trust one another anyway. Rose grew up hearing the story of that terrible transformative night. The same way Emma had lived it, not as a frightening tale meant to caution her, but as the foundation stone of everything good that had followed, and on her 10th birthday. When she finally asked her mother outright why she'd been named for a sister she'd never known. Clara answered with the same plain honesty that had carried her through every hard season of her life. "Because love doesn't stop just because someone's gone," Clara told her. "Your sister Rose taught me how to love fierce enough to survive losing everything. And you, my Rose, you taught me that love could still find its way back into a heart that thought itself closed for good. Both of you live in that name, and both of you live in this family whole and complete and never ever forgotten." Years later, when Emma Whitmore had grown into a capable young woman, managing her own portion of the family ranch's ledgers with the same fierce competence her stepmother had once brought to fighting off a corrupt land baron. And Rose had grown tall and stubborn, and utterly devoted to the horses her father had taught her, to gentle from the time she could first walk. Folks in the county still told the story of that terrible night, when a desperate father had pounded on Clara Bennett's gate in the pouring rain, and the widow who'd opened it without a moment's hesitation. They told it as a cautionary tale, sometimes a lesson about the dangers of judging strangers too harshly before knowing their hearts. They told it as a romance, other times the story of two wounded souls finding healing in each other against every hard lesson life had taught them separately. But most often they told it simply as what it had always truly been. The story of a family built, not by accident of blood, but by the deliberate, courageous choice two broken people made to open a locked gate on the worst night of their lives, and to keep choosing each other and the children fate had woven between them every single day that followed. The Blackwood name eventually gave way to Whitmore on the old ranch sign at the front gate, repainted fresh one spring by Caleb's own steady hand, and travelers passing through that stretch of Montana territory, in later years, would sometimes stop to ask about the ranch's reputation for fairness, for good stock, for a hospitality that seemed to run deeper than simple business sense might explain. The old-timers who answered always told it the same way. In the end, whatever embellishments the years had added to the telling, that the finest ranch in the county had been built not on stolen land or manufactured lies, the way Harold Whittaker had once believed fortunes were made, but on the simple, unbreakable foundation of two people who'd chosen honesty over fear and love over loneliness, and had never once in all the years that followed regretted the choosing. Clara Whitmore lived to see her ranch become one of the finest and most prosperous in the entire Montana territory, her name spoken with respect rather than pity, by the same townsfolk who'd once doubted her, and she never once, in all the long, full years that followed, regretted the desperate stranger and his dying daughter who'd changed the whole shape of her lonely, careful life with nothing more than the courage to knock on a locked gate in the pouring rain. And Caleb, for his part, kept the promise he'd made to Mary in that cold February bedroom so many years before, though not in any way he could have imagined. On the day he made it, he never let his daughter go, without not for one single day of her life, and he found in the family he built afterward with Clara Bennett that a broken promise could still, against every hard lesson grief had taught him, be made whole again, one honest day at a time, in a home built by two people brave enough to choose love over fear and family over loneliness for the rest of their long and grateful lives. That, in the end, was the whole truth of it, plain and complete. A locked gate, a desperate knock, and two broken hearts that chose against every hard lesson the world had taught them to become whole together. And nothing Harold Whittaker, or anyone else ever tried to take from them, could undo what love once chosen had built to last.